At 6:30, I'm going to call this study session of the City Council to order. All of council's here. We're joined by Planning Commission tonight. We have 3 items on our agenda tonight. First 2 is a joint meeting with the Planning Commission. So we'll just go around the room and make sure we introduce everyone, just so everyone gets names. I know we had name tags, but Kyle Schlachter, Mayor of Littleton.
Reed Bensing, City Attorney. Steve Barr, Mayor Pro Tem.
Pam Grove at large.
Robert Reichart, District 2, Council.
Forgot who he was for a second.
Yeah, Aaron Roethlisberger, Planning Commission.
Tim Neely, Planning Commission.
Matt Knight, Community Development Director.
Jessica Stenley, Development Engineering Manager.
Brent Thompson, City Engineer.
Dan Radulovich, Planning Commission.
Sherry Allman, Planning Commission.
Craig Coronado, Planning Commission.
Patrick Santana, Planning.
Patrick Driscoll, District 1.
Joel Zink, City Council.
Andrea Peters, District 4.
I'm Jim Beckman, City Manager.
Great. All right, well, the first item we have for discussion is the Littleton Engineering Design standards. We should have put standards for Littleton Engineering Design called SLED. I like that term, SLED. I was trying to look. Turn over to the city manager.
Thank you. I'll just very briefly say this project has been a long time coming. It's an important reference document for contractors and developers about some technical material. And with that, I will turn it over to our Community Development Director, Matt Knight, to start off the presentation.
Appreciate it. So I'm gonna turn it over to Jessica Stenley and Brett Thompson. So they've largely been the ones who have been, Brent has been working on this project for the better part of 5 or 6 years at this point. It's something that we're very excited to be able to get adopted this year. That is not,
Lots of starts.
there's lots of Yeah, and so Jessica's been, as our development engineering manager, has been taking this on over this last year that she's been here. And
6
so,
months.
It just feels like a year.
turn to Jessica.
Yeah.
At one point, this project was actually your responsibility.
Do you see how he delegated, right?
That's why it's taking so long.
It's taking so
Ah.
Suddenly it got faster.
Yeah, so we're gonna chat just a little bit about the Littleton Engineering Design Standards, just to give you all a brief overview of kind of what they are. I will, just as a forenote on the whole thing, is that this is a document we're recommending to adopt, but we have been using these standards regularly in our day-to-day jobs because they're industry standards. But this is just to formally adopt the document as part of Littleton. But I just wanted to clear that up. This isn't something we're not already doing, we are. It's just to formalize them in our city documentation. So, does the mouse work? Oh, there we go, okay. So what this presentation will go over is just what LEDs are. LEDs versus our TMP, just kind of give you some differences in comparison on what those 2 documents are. A summary of of the standards that are gonna be in there and an example of that, and then just next steps for the document itself. So why do we need LEDs? For very, very similar reasons that every other jurisdiction has them: for public safety, consistency among our projects, both private and public, compliance with industry standards, state standards, local standards, quality of life for our residents, and then sustainability. So what are LEDs? Basic definition is they are engineering and construction industry standards and specifications at the federal, state and local levels. Some of the examples of the standards that we currently use that we will reference in LEDs are from FHWA, so the Federal Highway Administration, CDOT, Colorado Department of Transportation, Mile High Flood District. So we use MEGPEG, that's for our Pavement Engineering Council. So we use a lot of standards that, again, like I said, are at federal, state, local levels. So these are examples of where we are pulling our standards from to put in this document. Where these are applicable to will be new construction, new development, right-of-way permits, and then how we maintain everything in our infrastructure, so just all over maintenance. And as I mentioned briefly, many of our other surrounding jurisdictions and neighbors have adopted standards like these, so that's just an example of a few of the jurisdictions that have them, which is why it's so important for us to have them as well. So this slide for, I wanted to give a little comparison of LEDs and the TMP, because I've heard discussions that both documents in the same discussion. But I'm gonna go through the LEDs column first. So what this document will be is technical federal, state, and local industry standards document. It's very, very technical. These will be updated administratively among staff based on our TMP, the land use code, and then any external agency revisions such as FHWA, CDOT, Mile High Flood District. This document will not have any projects in it. There'll be no programs, no work plans will be identified. It will be strictly standards and specifications. And then for implementation, it requires no funding. It's just our industry, again, engineering design and industry standards. So there's no funding required to implement this document and do what we're already doing but make it official. So then on the other side of this is the TMP. So the TMP, which is our Transportation Master Plan that we currently have, is a long-range planning document which guides our transportation policy. So we have the technical document of the LEDs and then this long-range planning document for the Transportation Master Plan. That plan currently forecasts for 20 years, so 2040. And that document is where we identify our projects and prioritization for all our capital improvement programs. Implementation of those projects and programs requires funding. It relies on funding such as grants or our capital investments. So that's the main differences between the documents. Again, just to reiterate that this is a very technical engineering design standard and specification document. So a summary of some of the things that are gonna be in this. So again, it's industry guidance for not just us, but our consultants, our contractors, our developers. Some of the topics that are gonna be included, and again, it's for construction. So we need to know what materials we're requiring our contractors and our developers to use: concrete, asphalt, traffic signal designs, like how we design our traffic signals, what the poles look like, what the caissons need to be designed at, water quality requirements, our storm and sanitary facilities, what pipes we require, where we require connections, tie-ins, how much dirt needs to be on top of those to be safe, and for loading. And then again, we also wanna really emphasize our contractor responsibilities, what they're responsible for on each project, not the city, not anyone else, not the public, it's what the contractor's responsible for. So again, this is just to help us really clarify roles and responsibilities for all projects and infrastructure that's being built in the city. So I wanted to throw an example up here, and again, engineers probably love this, but not everyone loves talking technical, but I threw in an example. So if we were gonna build a roadway, or do an improvement at an intersection, one of the items that our engineers would go and look at is what corridor or what type of roadway we're gonna be on. So a suburban connector is this example, and we use a composite pavement section on a suburban corridor. So that's a Mineral Avenue where Costco's going. We would look at that LEDs document and it would tell us what we need to build to meet those requirements as a composite pavement section, which in layman's terms is just two different layers of materials. So you have your asphalt on the top, and then your sub base or your base course is ABC Class 6, which is just rock. But what this does is it just very specific as it's shown there. It tells our designers and our contractors exactly what we expect our road to be. And again, this is for longevity, it's for sustainability, it's for consistency. It's going to make it very clear what we require, and that's what they will build. The other piece of this is for the planning side as well, is that public improvement acceptance. So we go through, once we get it built, we go through the process of accepting, final acceptance, initial acceptance. So it also aligns with the ULUC, that section right there, the 10.6.3.3. So once this example road is built, city inspector will notify the ComDev team, and one of our engineers will review it for initial warranty. And then once the warranty period, which is 2 years for us, once they're through the warranty period, we can pass them on a final acceptance and release their warranty to them. And then we issue that memo to say we accept it. All of that is also going to be in LEDs. So there'll be no question of our process once you build something, what we're gonna do and what the expectations are. And I think the warranty period is a big one for us, because if there's any items that we need in a punch list or or fixed or something we noticed during that time, that's the opportunity for us to go back and say, this is part of our process. So that's just an example of how we will implement it. So the next steps for this is we're in the draft period right now. We are still drafting the language and some of the standards we wanna include, but we are going to make it available for public comment, about a 45-day public comment period, once we get it to a point that's not a draft with red lines and everything. And then we anticipate that City Council will adopt LEDs in Q3. That's our anticipation that we will be completed with this document. And in between that time, we will, take public comment, take comments from staff as well and council and planning commission, and combine all that into the document before we put it up for adoption. And then for updates, like I mentioned earlier, they're gonna be administrative and as necessary. So staff can make those adjustments as we need to based on industry revisions, updates to the ULUC, the TMP. We just want everything to stay consistent, say the same thing, no contradictions. So by doing it this way, we're able to do that on a rolling basis as we need to, and we don't always have to come back and get approval. It'll just make it a lot easier for us, because the industry is constantly changing. The big federal documents aren't changing as much, but locally things are changing at a much quicker pace. So that's our plan for revisions moving forward. But that's all I have on this. For LEDs, that's LEDs. I don't know if you have anything to add, Brent or Matt.
Yeah, I think the one thing I might clear too about the administrative changes, so a good example of that is sometimes as your field crews see that a specific type of fitting or something in the field isn't working or it's not performing, having the ability to make a modification to that specification in real time to continue to basically operate your system without having to stop, hit pause, go to city council or planning commission for approval is really beneficial. If there's really big overarching things with that, well, there's not a ton of policy in this, but if there's large changes, traditionally I like, and Brent is the city engineer, is the overall person responsible for this document. If he feels that there's large changes to be made, those would be brought forth to council on a larger scale. But really the availability to make some of those small kind of physical material changes real time is what we're looking for.
Council, any questions?
This is kind of a two-part question. Do you expect the people to respond to the public comment to be more of the professionals, the contractors, developers, as opposed to the citizens?
Yeah, I would.
Both, or-
That's by anticipation.
Yeah.
I think the what you'll find is a lot of the stuff in there is very technical and but really consistent. I think one of the goals of developing this and why it has taken some time is that the metro area has really very different expectations about what they want from their contractors, and so we've spent some time trying to make sure that what we're doing is consistent with what others around us are doing. So when a contractor comes into Littleton, we're not doing something that they wouldn't expect to see someplace else. So it creates that level of consistency and predictability
Is this a big document?
so far.
Yeah.
So how do you get the word out to these contractors, developers, et cetera? And, are they going to spend time to go through this large document?
That's the hope. So our system that we use, T9, we have a bunch of contacts that we can blast that way. We also have personal contacts, but I think we're gonna publicly post it too.
Yeah, we'll go through a lot of the local kind of groups, so American Public Works Association, APA, others, right, that and leverage getting that information out there. I think I wouldn't expect a ton of information to come back from. It's possible for sure, but I think the goal of it is to be consistent and predictable.
Thank you.
Questions? Planning Commission? Driscoll?
What standards have we been using? I know some of our standards go back 20, 30 years and we're finally got everything updated, but what standards have we been using on this?
You gotta go back to that slide.
Which one?
There were a few of those.
Yeah. It's a minute, I'm sorry. You can,
The transitions.
the transitions are slow.
Yeah, I think so, we use FHWA and AASHTO standards for a lot of our transportation stuff, that's kind of industry approach.
Updated yearly? I'm kind of, not surprised at this presentation, but I'm just, I guess, surprised at this presentation. I would thought it would gotten updated yearly and this was more of a formality.
That the individuals, or that these individual standards are updated, or that
Yeah, that
ours
these
are?
individual standards are updated.
Yeah, the FHWA standards change very infrequently.
Infrequent, yes.
Yeah, MUTCD also, they just did an update.
They just did it last year.
CDOT's change about every 10 to
Yeah.
15 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think what you're trying to say is, is this redundant? Because I'm assuming all the specifications that we require are either in RFPs or scope of work or contracts, or we refer it to these documents they refer to here.
So really-
is this, I'm not disagreeing with the reason for this, but is this just a redundant document to say for,
We do have some local stuff that's specific, right? So
how are we getting through that now?
we're utilizing other municipality standards, so like
So
for.
say
for
CE, Inglewood standard for this, and that's what you're supposed to do here?
So for like Denver, we utilize Denver's criteria primarily for sanitary sewer design. And so, when somebody comes to us and says, hey, I don't like this design, where does it Littleton say you have to do this? Well, it says it exists in this engineering document, this engineering standards document, which we don't have. And so we're trying to consolidate these to a consistent location where all of those can be kind of applicable to what our community is looking for from that standpoint.
Yeah, I'd say for a lot of the city's projects, especially where there's funding involved, a lot of times we're using CDOT's or FHWA's requirements as it is. But to Matt's point, a lot of times we will get a question as to, what's the standard for this? And I wouldn't say we're making it up, but we are certainly pulling it from other resources that we have, so we don't have our own adopted.
I think you made a really good point there, Reed, which is, consistent with what I know about you. No, but I think that there are really three places where this is utilized. So one on the development side, one on kind of like right-of-way permitting side, and one on kind of private or public construction project side. So for public construction, yeah, you're using a lot of these standards, but in a different way. You're required to use CDOT, you're required to use FHWA, you're required to use, and you have to be pushed to those specific locations. But for those projects that are just specific to Littleton from a development standpoint or from a right-of-way permit, like if somebody wants to come and replace their sewer main or sewer service, right? We have to have standards for how they cut the street, how they replace the patch back. If they have to do potholes or test holes, how do those get filled? When is a permit required as it relates to that? And what are the expectations for warranty for some of those things? So those are very Littleton specific. But for like the bigger capital projects, nothing changes with this document. It's really focused more on the local stuff, so that's localized development and right-of-way permitting.
But it would be great in the future for some of those private projects where they could actually just go online and see what it is, so see what our grading, requirements are.
Save staff time for sure, having to explain it all.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about, we had that chart where you differentiated between the transportation master plan and the LEDs, right? And that came up, I know when that came up, because we were talking about why aren't we focusing an update on the transportation master plan to guide these design standards. And what you said to me is actually really concerning, that these big public projects are not changing. Because a year and a half ago, this city saw a child killed on its street. And in the aftermath, the public said, we want safer streets. So AASHTO, all of these federal regulations, they are the bare minimum. They are the bare minimum in how we design safe streets. You can design super wide lanes for super fast traffic, and speed kills. And I don't think the people of Littleton, I certainly don't, want speeding traffic through their backyards, like we've seen on Mineral. We see the street racing on Mineral. So when it talks to these big public projects, to what extent are these, because that's what we asked for. When you said we're not doing you said it doesn't make sense to do the transportation master plan because we're putting all this in the LEDs, and you just told me now that that's not changing. None of that is changing in the LEDs. So what kind of street safety standards are we putting in the LEDs, or are we just skipping over that?
Yeah, really good question. Thanks for that question. So I think the point of clarification is that we do have street cross sections are within little LEDs, right? the policy of how those are developed exists in the TMP. So when we went through the TMP process in 2019, I believe it's 2019, is that right? The city worked with a consultant to develop those street cross sections, and those specific ones like suburban, connectors, arterials, you know, all the different classifications. And so what we have proposed is to take a look at those and provide those for comment to the community to say, hey, what makes sense here, right? So the design standards for roads, and correct me if I'm wrong, guys, here, because I'm just a recovering engineer at this point. But if you, you know, the minimum bare criteria for that is largely geometric, right? So what the speed that's allowed on a road is determined by the geometry of the road. It doesn't mean that we can't restrict those standards or change those lane widths and things like that. And so those are things that we can if the policy is specifically slower speeds and things like that within the TMP, or even just as a city policy in general, we can modify those design cross sections as a part of LEDs and say, hey, this is what our minimum or our maximum lane width is to create. Hey, we want you know, if you want a policy, let's say for specifically off-street bike facilities, that policy lives in the TMP. But the design cross-section for what that would look like and how it would be built and the separation potentially from the roadway could be something that would live in LEDs to say, hey, this is what that separation would be. So yeah, they work very closely together, but the overarching policy lives in the TMP, not in LEDs. LEDs is the implementation of that, if that makes sense.
Are those specifications going to be in this first one before the policy is?
Yeah, right now,
I think that's what she's saying.
It sounds like the request was that we update the TMP so that we could set the policy to drive this safety, right?
Yeah.
And that got punted because no, we don't wanna update the TMP yet. We're gonna wait till like next year, but you're rolling out these LEDs now where the specifics that will dictate this street safety, that can really hold developers and construction firms and even the city staff and, you know, planning here to a standard for safe streets. That we're not gonna bother with that because the TMP hasn't been updated, and maybe when we update the TMP, then in a couple of years, we can update the LEDs again for these street safety. And in that time, more people will be killed.
yeah, I
Because
certainly
we've
hope
already
that's not
had it.
true. And I think from our perspective, we wanna make it really clear that the standards that we're putting forth in this do align with the Safer Streets Initiative work that we're doing. We are working really closely with our partners in Public Works to ensure that those design criteria are in there. So I think the overarching policy of connected neighborhoods and safe streets and walkable streets and bike facilities, those are overarching that exist currently in the TMP. So we're not proposing to change any of those things, those basic like standard policies we have. What we're looking to do is, you know, what I heard you say is that, you know, narrower roads are safer, slower speeds are safer. There's nothing nothing telling us that we can't incorporate those as we develop these standards, these LED standards. So we're not looking at changing. We also have neighborhood traffic mitigation, I believe, is in LEDs. Is that correct, or is that in the TMP? I can't remember.
TMP, the safer streets stuff.
No, but there's opportunities for neighbor traffic mitigation, like speed bumps and things like that. I can't remember.
Oh,
That's like chicanes.
I don't
to slow.
remember how
That's done through the Public Works
Okay.
Department, done
Yeah.
individually.
Different
Yeah.
document.
different document.
Different document.
Sorry.
But Matt, we are putting, so the TMP currently has typical sections for roadways, so you have a local street, you have the bike lanes, you have the narrower lanes, you have the multi-use path. That's an attachment in LEDs, so they will, those cross sections that are currently in there will be in there. Now, if we make revisions to those, that's when we would update LEDs. But currently, what's in there is going in LEDs, to say these are our cross sections for these types of streets. So those are going in there.
There's one more point I think that's really important to make right now, and I think in context between these two things is, number one, there's very little developable parcels currently in Littleton. So there's almost no greenfield left. And so the biggest impact that will be made on our transportation system will not come through LEDs, right? They'll come through capital project investment, so on a quarter by quarter basis. And so, you know, if there are these areas that we have concerns about of existing infrastructure, that's a collaboration with our capital program team, our engineering and public works team, and our Safer Streets Initiative. Largely what we're talking about here is the impact that the decisions we make on the development side, right? So a single lot developing on a parcel isn't gonna have as large of that major impact on the transportation system. It can influence future discussions related to it, so for instance, probably, and I'll love Brent to talk about this, cause he's been here longer than I have, but trying to figure out how to fit new infrastructure into old existing transportation infrastructure is incredibly challenging. Because you can't do it at a 50-foot wide level, right? You have to do it at much larger scale to be able to have impact. It actually can create really unsafe situations if you do that. So I don't know if you have thoughts.
Maybe some simple examples that have been implemented, say on some 50-foot wide lots, is a really good example. In downtown, as those have redeveloped, we've asked the developers to widen the sidewalks to new standards. But that's done on a parcel by parcel basis. It's not an entire cohesive corridor. But so we take those opportunities when they do exist. But again, it's parcel by parcel, so it's not creating that cohesive corridor. And like Matt said, that comes through the capital investments that we undertake.
Yeah, so LEDs will largely influence that side of it, the development side of it, less on the capital local side of it, where you are, those are really already owned by the city's planning and public works teams. If that makes sense.
Relatively quick question for you guys. We're gonna have an online red line for the whole LEDs document for public vendors and staff to give feedback on. Will the LEDs then live much like the land use code as a sort of searchable online code base?
It'll largely be, it won't be like ENCODE is, where it's embedded in the city's website, you know, where but it will be a PDF is largely how it will exist. We have accessibility.
So as you update it incrementally, the PDF will be updated and all of us,
Yes.
contractors, people can, okay, great.
Yes,
Actually,
yeah.
That would be a welcome change to just have that access. Great.
Yeah, just two quick questions. One, is this intended to apply to private development, private streets, or just for public right of way?
Man, that's a great question. The short answer is, you know, the standards that we're providing specifically related to transportation are focused on public infrastructure. When we review, and our goal is always on any new development is to have them meet that public standard where we can. There are some times where access and things don't allow for that, and then but we do want to make sure that there's a minimum standard that we meet in relation to that, so it's kind of case by case, but for instance, the Toll Parkview development, the major roadways through there are all public, and so those had to meet the public standards for that, and a lot of the private streets in there, the majority of the rest of that are private infrastructure, and so that are owned and maintained by the Metro District, and so they were reviewed under from that lens and not necessarily from the public lens.
And the other question, and following up on Aaron's comment, I think what you're referring to is a complete streets policy. And have we ever considered, I mean, in addition to a TMP and a LEDs, would a complete streets policy, which makes pedestrian and bicycle use equivalent to vehicular use on streets, be appropriate? Have we considered that? Or I know Denver's adopted that.
I think the existing TMP does reference not in the term of complete streets, but a complete networks policy. So I think the framework is there within the existing transportation master plan. Certainly as we look at undertaking an update to it next year, that can be enhanced more. But I think that does exist.
A number of cities have adopted that. I know Denver has.
Mayor, thanks. Just a comment. I'm hearing lots of kind of good comments about the broader policy considerations that we will be undertaking in the next TMP. And I think it's important. And I think as we've worked through some of these concepts with the council, as we're doing the Safer Streets planning, we've seen how they all relate and how it's important, for instance, to look at corridors and where the complete streets concept, for instance, will apply best and where it might not, you know, just from a cost standpoint, we're, you know, looking forward to implementing one here soon in a very, you know, kind of a carefully curated spot. So I think the TMP is where we can look at how all of those policy concepts fit together. And for now, I think that's why it's important to have that process and then make sure all of the technical implementing guidance be in the LEDs so that we can, you know, have the broader policy piece before we start to put the pieces into the LEDs, so.
Dan?
What happens, and this may be something that's actually in the document itself later on, might be answered later, but when the guidance document and the federal regulations tend to bump into each other and not agree with one another, which one gets, how is that resolved?
If it's on a state highway, state and federal jurisdiction governs. If it's on a local street or a local infrastructure, the local document governs.
Unless we happen to be using federal funds on a capital improvement project.
Then the federal has to.
Correct.
Yeah.
Whoever's paying decides.
If it was only that.
Construction safety standards, I was wondering what kind of standards you were using or what you were referring to for those construction contractor safety standards.
Oh, you mean their responsibilities?
Yeah.
Oh, it's not even safety, it's more or less just their responsibility in the process of the construction, what the city's responsible for versus them. It's just to clarify, because sometimes you get that conflict of, no, it's the city's responsibility, we're like, no, that's not ours. So it's just to clarify during that process, who's doing what, who's responsible for what, who owns what.
Okay, so this wasn't necessarily laying down a particular standard for like OSHA?
Not OSHA, yeah, no, not OSHA, that's where I thought you were going, no, not
I
OSHA.
just wanted to-
They already do their own thing,
Yeah,
let
no,
them do
that's what I
it.
was clarifying, thank you. Feels like there's a little bit of confusion, not between this set of standards, the TMP, but I feel like we also got a presentation last week that there's this internal Safer Streets Littleton strategic plan that is also driving at least the public works stuff. And so understanding kind of how those three things interact feels like something that we should talk about in the third quarter when we talk about this later. Because the strategic plan feels like an important thing, but it feels like it also captures a lot of the things that Aaron was talking about, is how does the city kind of enforce the goals of the Safer Streets Littleton plan?
Yeah, and I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive. You know, I think what the safer streets, there are, correct me if I'm wrong, and if I get this wrong, but you know, what we're talking about in LEDs is, let's say you want to put up, a narrow roadway section through somewhere, right? You might have that in Safer Streets that says, hey, this is what we're gonna put in here. When the contractor comes to build it, he's gonna wanna know what type of concrete he's supposed to use, what material he's supposed to use for the striping that he puts in. You know, how thick of pavement am I to be able to construct this, right? How do if I have traffic control, where do I set my traffic control up? So it doesn't mean that those two things don't work together in concert.
Yeah, no, I believe that they all work together. What I guess this is kind of a question for the city manager. Maybe we could spend some time in a study session before LEDs is finally approved, where I move a little bit forward on understanding how the three things work together. Because they feel important and complementary, but
Yes.
which comes first and who's on second,
I
and I
would
don't know who's on
say
third.
that what comes first is really the TMP in terms of the overall guiding policy document. Safer Streets is really intended to, the Safer Streets strategic plan is intended to give that effort some legs when it comes to the kinds of projects that are addressed in the TMP. Where do we want to do, what are some of the certain priorities for certain areas, and those will be linked to the principles and policies and overall guidance in the TMP. And then, regardless of where it's addressed in those first two, the engineering design details will live in the LEDs. So I think that's kind of our hierarchy, because the TMP will govern even broader things like transit, and more than we've addressed so far within Safer Streets. Safer Streets strategic plan will help us with staffing planning and budget and kind of and priorities for some of that work within that more narrow body.
To Aaron's point, I think that you just said that TMP is the priority important? Basically, she's saying, why are we using a 6-year-old document to create this new document if we're just gonna update the TMP and then have to update this again? So it feels like it's backwards. If we could have updated the TMP, do them kind of in conjunction there.
I'll just say, it's been a priority. When I started here a couple of years ago, I was very surprised that we didn't have engineering design standards in place. Most of what's in this document is very, technical, product specific, pipe fittings, those sorts of standard things that we can point contractors to. I think where there is some overlap or where there is some entree for street widths and standards for bike lanes and things like that, I would say it's important that we put this very kind of fundamental technical document in place and then look forward as we are to the broader policy discussion around transportation, safer streets within that TMP, and then we can follow up with LEDs. It's important that we get these standards in place just for a reference for our developers and contractors.
Sure.
Yes, it seems that, and I agree with you about the sequence and thinking about it, because it sounds like the LEDs the standards, there's a minimum that has to be done. In some cases, it feels like a maximum, but the policy piece is where we can push it further than the minimum. Is that correct? So, I mean, you gotta follow these rules, however, we could, in some sense, make them stronger through the policy.
Yeah, and I guess I want to be clear to some extent. So, we're actively writing these right now, right? And so we're not writing them, absent the lens of this transportation safety stuff, right? We are utilizing that lens as we develop these. And so, and again, I recognize too that you guys don't have the benefit of having read any of this, right, at this point either. So
It's like fine, thanks.
Yeah.
Riveting stuff.
It's one of my strengths.
But yeah, I think, when you talk about minimum standards, right, again, the lens, when you talk about that, is really important. So like, when you say, well, the minimum asphalt pavement thickness needs to be 6 inches. That's true, but if you do it on a project level and you're doing it on a different roadway, the city may come back and say, no, you actually have to do 10 inches here because it's mineral and we have this specific loading and your geotechnical engineer says you have to do this instead. So just because with the minimum in these standards exists, strictly to have a base protection for the city from an infrastructure standpoint. The large component of this, or the most important piece of these standards, is to allow for us to have more predictability in how things are constructed so that we can ensure the infrastructure lasts a long time, right? So if you don't want to let a contractor put a 2-inch thick concrete sidewalk in because it's probably going to crack and break and fall apart, right? We want something that if we're a parks vehicle or if we have an ATV that's going to go on it or whatever, we want minimum thickness so that we make sure that we're getting that longevity and we're not having to replace that every few years because concrete is really expensive, right?
So would that be in the TMP or would that be in the?
That's in LEDs.
LEDs.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in those cases, then you are, if that's what you would like to have, or the city would like to see, then you're exceeding the basic, the standard.
Yeah, so going back and maybe another point of clarification here is, so when developers come in and have to do designs, right? They're not necessarily, they don't just go through LED and say, well, this is the minimum I have to do, right? They have to do geotechnical analysis. They have to do transportation impact analysis, right? They're doing drainage studies and drainage analysis, right? To kind of figure out what is the actual infrastructure needed on a project by project basis, right? If there's no guidance at all, right, it's really hard for us to say, no, you have to do a 6-inch thick sidewalk there because it's mineral and we want to make sure that it lasts a long time. And their response is, well, show me where it says that. Right? We have to answer that question so often. It's like, well, show me why I have to have the sewer has to be designed to allow 2 feet per second flow. Right? We don't have anything physically to say here. Littleton says, we say, well, we use Denver's. It's like, well, show me where you say you have to use Denver's. Right? And so we're constantly battling these discussions about like what minimum standards we want. And that's the critical piece of this is we want our infrastructure to last a long time. It is incredibly expensive for the city to have to take on future liabilities for substandard infrastructure installed by developers. And that's the ultimate base purpose of LEDs, is to make sure that we are doing that, we're taking care of the city's infrastructure.
The second part of my question is on the safer streets. It seems that is more of retrofitting in terms of existing infrastructure versus new. I mean, you were saying that we know that we don't have a lot of developable properties anymore. So a lot of the safety issues we have to do with what's existing, it seems. Is that true?
Yeah, I think a great example, if I can just provide one, as it relates to a success of you know, the fact that we don't have LEDs, but we've using this lens to kind of determine what we want our developers to have is the Toll, Parkview, and River Park projects, right? Through the design of that, we recognize the need to have a large multi-use trail through the middle of that. The developer and Toll didn't want, both Toll and Evergreen weren't super excited about the idea of having to give up 16 feet for concrete to have a sidewalk and a multi-use path. But, through our conversations with them, we tried to let them know how much this was a priority for us to be able to put this, and ultimately we worked with them to get that installed. So even though we don't have LEDs, and even though that's not shown currently potentially in the TMP, right? Our staff is still prioritizing these things regardless of the fact whether or not they're shown someplace or not. And the great thing about, I think, our team and Public Works is that we really prioritize relationships with these developers to be able to kind of help them understand what are Littleton priorities and who we are and why those things are important. And so sometimes it's really easy just to say and look on the surface and say, well, show me where it says that, like I said, but when you build those relationships and work together to kind of build cities, build communities and build infrastructure, it's way easier to have those conversations, say, hey, this is how it'll help you and your community to be able to, hey, yeah, you guys are gonna wanna ride your bikes along this, you want access to the Mayor Carter Greenway Trail, and show those benefits through that too. So I think that's important.
Also throw out there too, I mean, we pointed out some like big planning level, like major transportation planning kind of design modality change, which I think does live in the TMP. A majority of it does, but also this LEDS document is gonna capture the 99.9% of crap we don't see, which is like rebar spacing on a pour, or like the patchback on my sidewalk where somebody filled it with asphalt instead of concrete. So, this is also a way for us to hold, folks accountable to those standards, even if we aren't necessarily out there catching them at every single little spot beyond our major capital projects. I think it goes like far beyond the stuff we typically see or observe.
And to get the intersection, kind of the TMP and the LEDs, and I know you mentioned that it was primarily for new development, but, talk about this retrofitting of, I assume we would use the LEDs if there was, for something like Aberdeen Village, when all the streets were, not all, but most reconstructed. And so I think that's kind of where Aaron's like, if we had this policy in here, like, hey, we want to, make the streets a little narrower rather than put everything back exactly as it is. I know the LEDs is more about the numbers, hey, this is what the base is, this is what the width is, and the sidewalk is. But I think that's you haven't finished the document here, but having gone through and say, this is how we're gonna put things back differently when we put them back. Because there are sections of the city that, I know it's capital, but we're still gonna follow the LEDs.
Yeah, yes and no. The caveat there is, I think, when you're looking at those big, like Aberdeen Village, you're looking at those big projects for like a mill and overlay or asphalt replacement, those are city projects. So again, our Public Works team is looking at everything through that kind of transportation TMP lens to say, hey, we have an opportunity here. What do we want to do with this, right? And so they may say, yeah, we want to narrow roads. And so I don't know that they would necessarily, in the case of this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they might go to the cross section and say, well, hey, this is this type of road. Is this the type of roadway cross section we want? They might start there. But if that's wider than what we think the community wants, I think they would take the opportunity to take a look at it and say, hey, what is something we could do here to kind of to provide a different level of infrastructure?
I think Aaron's point is that the TMP is 6 years old and it doesn't have the information that's been updated with the last, 18 months of work here. I think that was kind of what you were getting at.
Yeah, and also, like, there's, what I'm also hearing too is, and I'm in agreement, as far as, what we're talking about here as far as, the construction standards and the implementation standards that are gonna go in here. what I'm not hearing is how are we setting direction in requirements to our own planning department, our own public works department that says, when you resurface a road, you will not stripe lanes wider than 10 feet on roads with 40-mile or lower speed limits. You will not allow parking within 15 feet of a corner. You're gonna daylight intersections. You will when we redo roads, when Littleton goes to spend taxpayer money to resurface roads, to restripe roads, Windermere north of Main Street is actually a really kind of good, bad example, right? Because it was redone, repainted, beautiful, smooth asphalt surface, and they stuck this bike lane in between the parking and the cars. And it feels incredibly dangerous to ride down it because you're afraid somebody's gonna open your door and you're gonna weave into traffic and you're gonna get hit by a car. A simple standard for that is to say that you move a bike lane, that if you have width for a bike lane and on-street parking, you put the parking outside on the lane closest to the traffic versus the bike lane, right? You use the cars as a means to buffer that bike lane. That saves money on infrastructure, that provides safety on a couple of fronts. If we put that in writing in our LEDs that say, if you on roads wider than this, or roads of a minimum width of this, that will allow on-street parking, you shall provide a parking buffered bike lane. On roads of 40 miles an hour less design speed, lane width shall not exceed 10 feet, right? I'm an engineer, and I thought this was the requirements document, and it is the requirements document, but it's not all of the requirements that we need, right, for ourselves, for when we go to design and redo these public projects, that we just kind of go, what do we want to do here, right? As opposed to saying, we have this set of standards that we are applying to ourselves to make the street safer, because that information is all out there on how to do it,
Yeah, and I would probably ask Brent to
Yeah.
answer that question, because that might.
Yeah, I think there are cross-sections that are gonna be within the transportation master plan that follow the guidance, within LEDs that follow the guidance of the transportation master plan. So different classifications having different speeds, different lane widths, different amenities. I think what's important to remember is that everything is context sensitive too. Fitting an ideal cross-section within a given roadway doesn't necessarily fit every roadway or every neighborhood. So it needs to be context sensitive, look at the impacts to the adjacent land uses and things like that. And that's not done on a project by project basis.
I don't think Aaron's disagreeing with the need for this or the use of this document. I think it's just more the timing of the order of things, because we're putting all this money in concrete into the ground now, and if we wait 3 years, it might change because the policy and the TMP would change, and I think she was just basically saying we wanna prioritize the TMP.
Yeah, and I
And to
think,
some extent, I think we do need to have requirements, right? And if it doesn't fit, if the context doesn't fit the requirement, you get a waiver for it, right? That's not an uncommon thing, but you always start with this set of requirements, with this process. And then you identify the deviations from that process, right? And yeah, ideally, the TMP could do a lot more in calling out that, but if this is where we're at and this is where we're updating, do we have an opportunity to take that and take some of those safety conscious, safety forward requirements and include them?
I guess from my professional experience, that's not where this lives. It doesn't live in the engineering standards, right? This is largely meant from a standpoint of a roadway construction standpoint, it's meant to handle new infrastructure. Like, if you were, the information of taking Windermere north of that, right?
Sure.
We wouldn't, if they were gonna go pave that, I don't think, we wouldn't take the cross-section that we have in the LEDs and say, well, how do we stripe this and how do we build it? What we would do is largely it gets put back in a similar way, I think, which is your context, how are we taking that opportunity to look at it? And I think from my perspective, and I would ask Brent to talk about this, and maybe something we could bring back later would be, that really is a public works and city engineering policy on how we address that, right? So every time you're paving a road and every time you're building your capital program, we say, hey, we need to take a look at every one of these streets we're doing in 2025 and make sure that as we're paving them or we're modifying them, that we're doing so to meet ADA compliance, that we're meeting our Safer Streets initiatives, that we're doing all of these things, that we're striping it accordingly. How much width do we have? Can we put a bike lane in? Can we put a buffered bike lane in? what are the opportunities? And my understanding is, and I don't, you know, again, I wanna give Brent the opportunity to talk about this, is that is what we actually do. So that is actually happening on the capital side of things. LEDS is not meant to say, well, to get to that level of detail about how, you know, when you put in a bike lane, or when you modify the width of a bike lane, or when you provide a buffered bike lane. That might exist in the TMP from a standpoint of saying, hey, this roadway classification should identify these specific elements as available for this type of roadway classification, but they don't always fit really neatly because of the width of the existing infrastructure. So sometimes we have to take a step back and say, okay, where are the opportunities here? And so then that's what our professional staff is paid to do, to take a look at those things and say, hey, how do we approach this? What is the best way to do this? What is industry standards? What do our leadership team say is a priority? How does the TMP guide us? What lens are we using? And so we take all of that information, we work really collaboratively with all of our partners across the organization, across, you know, with Arapahoe County when we intersect with CDOT and things like that. So that's kind of what our role is to make sure. LEDS really is, how thick do you want the asphalt? How wide do you want the bike stripe? You know, if you're gonna put a buffered bike or a protected bike lane, what is the barrier you're putting in there? What does it look like? How does a contractor know that that's what they have to go purchase? So to meet those standards. That's really the purpose of LEDS. Does that make sense?
With that, and I would expect that we're gonna have a vigorous discussion about, you know, where we have different types of bike lanes, what kind of protection, how wide, how we park, you know, where we have those standards on various corridors. But that's why those are policy, you know, discussions, and that's why I think it's best that we don't treat them in a technical design standards document until they've been through our kind of larger policy process that will be the TMP.
Last question that I have is, can I go back to something you said before about, you know, updates, if, you know, council's approving the LEDs, everything else updated after there's gonna be updates are gonna be mostly administrative unless Brent decides it's not. Where is that threshold? Because, I mean, it's, if it's just, I mean, you could have a community development director that just says, we can change the whole thing, we approve it, and you can write it word for word, it's not big enough to go to council, so I just wonder where.
It's not really ethical, so I don't think we do that.
Well, not all government employees are.
No, I know, it's just, as PEs.
All of ours are.
As PEs, I don't know, no, and Brent, you can answer where cause pretty much the document says it's at the discretion of the city engineer a lot. Brent is.
Or designee.
Or designee, or it does, it says or authorized designee, but Brent has, majority of the say, but I mean, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, I don't anticipate huge changes in this document when FHWA and CDOT make updates, is again, to Matt's point, it's like your bike stripe went from 5 inches to 6 inches, or it goes this type of retro reflectivity on your signs, or your asphalt needs to go from this type to this type, like those are the small.
I'm not arguing to see all the
yeah.
changes, I'm just
I'm saying that's majority of what we're going.
Usually if it's a specific like level of design, so like for instance, if we wanna decide that our roadway speeds needed to change as it relates to AASHTO design criteria, right, we're gonna wanna understand what council's policy is as it relates to that. So we would come to you with a study session and say, hey, here's something that we think is coming down from whatever direction that says we need to evaluate this and it should be updated, and so we would have that conversation. We can also handle it in a similar way that we do ULUC, where if we have a bunch of ones that we wanna bring at once, we could bring that and say, hey, here's all the stuff we wanna update, you know, and then adopt that modification via resolution if that's council's.
I like that idea, but either that idea or some description of what is the threshold in the ordinance. Like, what is the threshold for review by?
I think we should take this as direction to bring that back within the LEDs.
Yeah, I agree.
really don't, I wanna see.
I think it's in there, I just don't know if this
can't
exactly.
I think it's in
If
there
you could
too.
include it, that would be great, so we know what the threshold is.
I will tell you 99% of it will be those small things.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I don't.
So you guys may not see it very often, that's all I was getting at, it's like a 1%,
Yeah.
maybe these big changes will
Sometimes the
happen.
city engineer wants the new shiny book though, you know, different color cover.
It says revision
Because if
number,
it
yeah.
crosses a threshold and we don't see it, we will hear about it, I'm sure someone will come in.
I think it's gonna be policy basis.
Great. All right, well, let's move on. I can get my computer computer back up.
It's also Blink-182.
Thank you guys for your feedback, appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Right, next up, we're gonna get into, let's see. Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Come back, please, John.
Matt's sticking around?
Of course I am.
Just Matt, okay. Anybody else coming up here? Oh, is Brent coming up? Jared? Sure. Go ahead.
Needs to include requirements. Very feel what we'd like, you know?
All right, so the next agenda item is discussion of topics of upcoming land use code changes or amendments here. This is distinct but related to any of the previous land use code changes that we may have discussed in the near past. But I know there was some foreshadowing of these, or some of the changes that are required by state statute from the General Assembly session in 2024, and so I'm gonna go through and see where we are.
Thanks, Mayor. I'll turn it over directly to Matt Knight.
Yeah, we debated, do I turn that over to Jared, turn it over to, I'll introduce Andre.
Turn to Mike Gent, there we go, see.
We can just keep
Yeah.
popcorn in this if we want,
Andrea Vaughn.
but thank you. Andrea Vaughn, a senior planner with community development, and I'll be presenting tonight on some of our 2025 ULUC updates that we are proposing. But my manager, Jared Chipman, will be presenting as well, and we were going to have Kelsey Stanfield here tonight, but unfortunately she's unable to attend, so we're fortunate enough that Brent Soderland will fill in and also discuss.
I'm a poor substitute, so I'll do the best I can.
So tonight we kind of have these two buckets of conversation that we'll have. So we do have our legislative updates from the 2024 session, and then we have our non-legislative updates. Some of these items many of you will recognize from previous work planning efforts. And we don't really have any discussion set for the end. We're kind of hoping, we have some guidance in this that we're asking for throughout, so a little bit more informal, so please do feel free to jump in. From the 2024 session, there are 4 updates that we've identified that we will need to do. The first is as it relates to occupancy limits in HB 24-1007. The city was really ahead of this when it when it adopted the ULUC back in 2021. We do not define family, which is what the state is asking all jurisdictions to remove from their zoning codes. However, there was one carryover for manufactured parks, limiting occupancy to 1 family per home. So staff is just moving to strike that. That is a relatively minor update.
Yeah, just to note, a lot of jurisdictions had clauses within their statutes, within their codes that would say no more than X amount of unrelated persons could live in the same household. And the thought behind it was they didn't want like fraternity houses, for example, to be in their jurisdiction or anything like that. So a lot of jurisdictions along the Front Range developed language prohibiting that, which we removed back in 2021, but I missed one. So.
And in conjunction with that, we do have an occupancy limit, but that is found in the building code, and it's based on a square footage calculation for the structure. It is not something that ULUC really tackles.
That's safety related, right?
Yeah, safety related.
Health and safety. So the next legislative item that we will need to update our code to maintain compliance with our ADUs. and that's in HB 24-1152. The state did identify several kind of goals and intents for this legislation, really trying to provide better housing opportunities, particularly as it relates to aging in place and intergenerational living, as well as some economic benefits to homeowners and renters. And important to note that this is effective June 30th, 2025, so even if we don't update our regulations, we will have to be compliant with the state in implementation. But I wanted to kind of be clear as we're going through the legislative updates that while the state has their own goals, so does the city of Littleton, and we think that there's actually a lot of overlap with our goals as well as the state. So Envision Littleton, through some of its concerns, goals, and policies, identified really this need for additional housing for intergenerational living, and really providing some relief to homeowners as well as renters, which we believe ADUs can help provide. Also, through this presentation, as we're discussing legislative updates, we have on our left the legislative requirement, and on our right, some opportunities that staff has identified to kind of push a bit beyond that. We just want to make clear that what you see on the left, we've been kind of referring to as our non-negotiables. So these are things that we have to do. And then on the right, we have these little bit more of these negotiables, things that we can look towards doing to make more unique to Littleton. So the state does require that all jurisdictions effectively treat ADUs similar to a single family dwelling. So your setbacks have to be similar, not even similar, the same. It also removes the requirement for parking for ADUs. So the state, our code has 1 parking space per AD required. Per state, we'll have to strike that. In addition, setting our setbacks must match the established setbacks for accessory structures. And where staff would like to talk today as it relates to ADUs, we do have a size limit for detached ADUs of 800 square feet. We also define contained and attached ADUs, which can just match the floor footprint of the existing single-family dwelling. We would recommend or like to explore the possibility of increasing from 800 square feet to 1,000 square feet for detached ADUs, as well as looking at our buffer yard requirements for ADUs. We do have some height considerations in our contextual standards that would require a buffer yard to be installed. But we've found that that's a little bit of a barrier for people that are looking to construct onto an existing structure, such as a garage, which may have been placed. And if you are exceeding 115% of your neighbor's heights, the average of their heights, you would have to install a buffer yard. And staff has just identified this as a potential barrier for ADU construction.
Who wants to talk about each slide? Okay. I just had a question on those. Is there any restriction on just an addition to a home? Could a house add a 1,200 square foot addition onto the home?
So the house could add an addition on the home as long as it was smaller, and it could be 1 square foot smaller than the principal structure. So they still have to be truly accessory in that.
I'm not talking about an accessory, I'm just talking about an addition to the house, not an ADU. I'm just saying if I have a
Absolutely, as long
2,000 square foot house, if I wanted to put if I had a big lot, if I wanted to put a 3,000 square foot addition, is there any restriction for that?
as long as it meets setbacks, et cetera.
There are
There is
building
a-
coverage.
As long as I'm not, getting out of code there, so that doesn't, okay. And then the same with the buffer yards, these are not going beyond what would be allowed in a current addition of a house or a current house. It's not saying that you could get closer to your neighbor's yard than you could if you were.
No, so it's not impacting the setbacks. There are really some screening requirements, so it's additional landscaping depending on if you have a fence or not. But it's not allowing for an encroachment into any setback.
Yeah, this is not any encroachment that couldn't already exist with an addition or a construction site, or construction of a house.
So the buffer yard is about height? That's.
In the contextual standards, that's when it would be applied.
If it's required, yeah.
Would the
Yeah.
buffer yard apply right now to basically if you were to pop the top on your house?
It could.
It depends, it's a calculation that we have, depending on the height of the two neighboring buildings
Sure,
on
okay.
either side, yeah.
But it's the same buffer yard requirement that exists for houses that exists for ADUs?
Yes, so, and that's where, it would, the buffer yard treatment would effectively be the same because that is applied to a single family dwelling. It's just, again, it's one of those barriers in our code to ADU construction that we've identified, having spoken with several homeowners that are interested in doing something like this. The addition of having to plant new trees to block that, it creates additional costs that some homeowners can't absorb.
Yeah, so you're asking us to
Ignore that.
to change the buffer yard requirement for ADUs to make them more lenient than our current code.
No.
Well, that's what I'm clarifying.
No, yeah, no, she just said
Well,
that.
more lenient with regards to where our ADU
Where
standards
ADUs
are,
can go.
but not necessarily what family home development
It
currently.
would be an
I'm-
exemption for the ADUs.
Yeah, so that sounds like, if it's an exemption for ADUs, that sounds like more lenient than building. It's stricter for the addition than the staff is asking us to consider I believe, you can tell me if I'm wrong, which you will, but more lenient, consideration for ADUs than for additions when it comes to buffer yards.
No, I just asked that, you said no.
I apologize, I may
So if you did an addition off of your home, it's, if you pop the top, and you were higher than your neighboring two properties by over 115%.
Right.
Sorry, the calculations are hard to visualize sometimes. Then yes, you would have to work on a buffer yard requirement, fulfilling that buffer yard requirement. So what staff is asking is we're trying to, we've identified a couple locations where we might be able to limit the barrier to entry on these items. And we're seeking council and plan commission's input on that. If the input is yes, we're happy to write that in the code. If the input is no, we're also happy to leave that in the code. But that's the request that we
So then, I'm confused
So then
because-
Robert was right.
Well, because so there would be no buffer requirements for ADUs anywhere then?
No, it would just be less than what it is currently.
For an ADU, but not,
Zero, it sounds like.
that's fine, okay.
Well, that's not to say that the recommendation couldn't be to reduce buffer yard requirements for ADUs, right? Like, so if you were 150% higher rather than just 115, because an ADU notionally is a smaller structure, right? So it's not gonna be like 3,000 square feet times two, right? It's, I mean, a garage, a typical two-car garage is what, 25 by 20, right? So this isn't that's not gonna be a huge giant structure that's towering over you either. So maybe the idea is that the buffer yard requirements for houses, because those have much larger footprints, would be that 115%. A buffer yard requirement for an ADU might be 150% because it's just a smaller structure overall. So, but I think that's something we
Is
can
there a
look
buffer
at,
yard
but-
requirement for an ADU proposing this?
So currently it would be keeping the existing buffer yard requirement for structures that exceed those heights. So whether it be a new structure that tear down and rebuild, or if it's an addition onto it, we still look at those contextual standards. And right now, we would still have to look at those contextual standards for an ADU. So yes, as of right now, under current code, you would be required to place the buffer yard.
But the proposal says if you had an ADU go up, if you exceeded that 115%, you would not be required.
That's what we're inquiring.
Yeah, I think we're seeking council's feedback on if you have a preference to keep the buffer yard requirements or to eliminate the buffer yard requirements for ADUs.
Or modify, yes.
Or modify. So I think the key here, and I don't know if this is clear or not, if it's not, but really the purpose of removing the buffer yard for an ADU for basically, it would be that, there's a lot of garages that exist in those, and so those are usually in the corners of those properties, and so if you leave the buffer yard requirements, it essentially would eliminate the ability to pop the top on that garage to create an ADU.
What's the advantage for
Keeping the buffer yard requirements? I think it's just, that is really the distinction.
Is that the neighbors that now would have people looking into their yard?
potentially, I mean, it's the proximity to the property boundary, I think the challenge too is if you've got, if you require certain trees, right? Putting a tree through that area, and correct me if I'm wrong, and your ADU is sitting on top of your garage, it's like not necessarily likely that tree is going to provide exceptional screening for
some time.
a while.
Who's opportunities to further city goals, is this staff requesting this, is this?
Yes, this is
This is staff's recommendations.
Coming out of the Vision Littleton plannings, a lot of the goals for housing that we've had.
Was to encourage ADUs, that's why we allowed ADUs, and ADUs haven't been built because there's these barriers.
Yes.
And we think that this request here, where we're asking council and planning commission to consider either a removal or reduction of the buffer yard. Some of our SLR and MLR lots would really struggle to add an ADU. They do tend to be a much smaller lots. And when you have these existing structures, it can be really beneficial to either convert or add on to them. And again, it's just another barrier in the code that we've identified to construction.
But since they have smaller lots, that would further impact the neighbors without a buffer, right? You're popping things up and now there's no barrier and then the neighbors are impacted.
I think
Well, they
once
could build
again-
a two-story home too, though, and it would have the same effect with,
You're not recommending eliminating the buffer for
no.
a pop-up on a home, which is, it's still impacting the neighbors.
So, I mean, it sounds to me though, like if somebody had a corner garage on their lot, like many people do, we would be saying, well, everyone else who doesn't have that situation or doesn't live on a smaller lot with that corner garage that's right up against, the fence line, that everyone else can have an ADU, but you can't, or you have to make a decision on whether or not you want a garage or an ADU.
Tear it down, move it.
And just to be clear, we're not talking about a binary, right? So it's not, we have to have no buffer yard or yes to buffer yards. There's an option here to have some middle ground, so we can still respect, the neighbors that we have, but also maybe free up some more folks to do this.
Do we specify?
Is that true? Okay.
Absolutely, I think Commissioner Roethlisberger's comment is a great example of how there can be a middle ground.
Well, I don't see it, I could see it in the bigger lots that it would not impact the neighbors, but when you get in these smaller lots, things are starting to get closer together and all of a sudden, especially if you start increasing the size, you're in essence, even it's smaller, it's starting to become the house behind the house. It's changing everything,
And the places we've allowed these have been in those smaller lots right now, and that hasn't come to fruition, so.
Yeah, I think
well, that's because, for other reasons, because we had limitations in our code, which are now gone.
Yeah, to clarify, so,
But again, it doesn't mean you're necessarily we're not talking about making it a free-for-all either, I think, in terms of building a two-story ADU with absolutely no buffer yard right up against the edge of the property line, right? We're still talking about,
What protects it, I'm not getting that.
well, there's setbacks to start with.
Yeah. So the setbacks are gonna take care of that, is what you're saying.
Well, and then plus, again, we're saying, I think there is something to be said that we can talk about a middle ground in terms of some of these buffer yard requirements, right? Rather than saying like, okay, you're gonna have to have a buffer yard for 15% greater than your neighbors, you can go to 50% neighbor and now you need a buffer yard, right? Cause garages a lot of times too, especially older garages, right? They're not as tall, right? Like you go to older garages in older neighborhoods, cars were smaller, they weren't as tall, nobody had these, lifted pickup trucks and, everybody fit in these garages. I know people who have these older houses and they had to change things or they had to park on their driveway because they literally could not fit their car in their garage because it was so old. So when you're talking about putting a second level on a garage of that age, it's not gonna be like, a 40-foot structure all of a sudden. It could, you could get up to 25, right? And if your neighbor's house peak is at, 15, well, you're over the 50, you're over the 15%, but you're under a 50, 150%. So where's the middle balance?
In the larger
Dan's waiting
lots.
patiently.
Sorry.
Good math, I was impressed.
First off, I think the biggest limiting factor we had in our current code is it had to have alley access. That basically cut 80 to 90% of it, of everything out of having an ADU. What I would suggest is some sort of altered look at the buffer yard, but also doesn't meet the setbacks, because there are going to be times where you run into an older home that these things weren't built during modern code times or whatever, and these things are literally right on the property line. That might be a different story than if it actually meets the setback. Those are different situations, and these almost become, it's tough to visualize it, because sometimes they're their own sort of their own issue, each one by one almost. But
Do we specify what kind of plants you have to put in the buffer yard?
Could
we
yeah.
clean that up and instead say, as a master gardener, like, plants are very, depending on the sun and the shade and all the things, like, should we be dictating that? Could it be more like you need to put a plant that will grow to this height and this width, or,
So we indicate the number of trees, ornamental trees, evergreens, and shrubs, et cetera. So we.
not down more specific?
Correct.
Okay.
I just think in the
Craig's-
smaller.
Just one clarifying question, I'm a little bit confused, but I think the setbacks must match the setbacks established for accessory structures, which is usually less than the primary structure. So the primary structure, when it triggers your example with the addition, the height, buffer yard trigger, so we're talking about smaller setbacks to begin with, right?
Only.
For the rear, it would be, most of our accessory structures are 5 feet for the rear. But for the front and side, those would be maintained.
Accessory structures must meet the same as primary, they'd be the same as primary for side or
Right.
front. Okay,
Right,
just
it's
rear,
rear.
so.
And most of our setbacks, because we did take a look at this, most of our side yard setbacks are 5 feet on one side and 10 feet on the other side. So it's based off of the alignment of the home. So if you're, facing south, your north and west are, I think, 5, south and east are 10.
So being that a lot of lots are back to back, I guess that would, in my mind, we should consider keeping buffer yards in certain conditions, just because we're gonna be that much closer to the property line.
I think the good news is nobody has heartburn over the 1,000-foot part, so.
I have heartburn over it.
I
Okay.
do too. I definitely recommend the 1,000-foot because.
Over all this crap. As you could only imagine.
Well, you've been effective at sharing your perspective, and I encourage you to continue to.
Why, just because.
Mayor Pro Tem?
How about we go council member by council
spoken
member,
quite a
see where we stand on each of the two issues, whether we want to explore them or not. We're not making a final decision tonight on any of this, right? And so the question in front of us is, do we look at modifying buffer and do we look at modifying to 1,000 foot?
I think we should address it, right?
Yeah,
That's
that's
exactly what he said.
That's what he's asking us to do.
That's what I'm saying, is that I would be in favor of both of those. That's one.
I'm perfectly happy with 1,000 square foot, but I'm not 100% sure about the buffer yard.
I'm against both of them, especially in the smaller lots.
I support 1,000 square feet, but I would like to explore options for a middle ground on the buffer yard requirement.
I'm against both of them. I think we still want to protect our character of our neighborhoods and our neighbors, our existing neighbors, and stop looking so much far out to all these people that don't even live in this community. Let's protect our neighbors.
I think this is about neighbors, since we're talking about intergenerational and aging in place. So I guess I'm confused about the first one, because I thought an ADU was okay as long as it was smaller.
So that is for attached and contained ADUs.
Okay.
We do have a maximum size for detached. Now, that there is the caveat there also that if you are in a smaller home to begin with, your detached ADU would not be able to be larger than the existing home.
Right. Currently, the max square footage in our code is 700 square feet.
For a detached.
800.
What's
But,
that?
and there's still a coverage per lot.
There's still coverage, so you can still, even if you hit that, you couldn't exceed the coverage, yeah, so.
Then I'm okay with both.
And I'm good with the 1,000 square feet, because there's restrictions if it gets, if it hits the lot coverage. And I think so the buffer yard, one of the middle ground, I think, to not just getting rid of it, but having some sort of middle ground, because there's
I like it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. And the planning commission can talk about it more when he gets back. Just for the sake of time here.
Let's make the
You heard what we said, so.
planning commission deal with the buffer.
Thousand square feet.
So the next legislative item that we have is minimum parking, and this is HB 24-1304. To be clear on this, this does remove the requirement for minimum parking for certain parcels. We'll get into that in a couple of slides. But it's not saying no parking. It's not eliminating the requirement for parking. Developers can certainly, and oftentimes they do with their financiers, determine how much parking is appropriate for a development. And to prevent overparking, we also have parking maximums, and those can remain in place. And the state really identified this as a way of reducing construction costs, as parking can be quite expensive to install, even though it is just pavement. Also creates more opportunities for housing along our high-frequency transit corridors, which is where we would like to see more density. And then there are some environmental benefits as well to reducing pavement, such as reducing the urban heat island effect. And this bill does go into effect June 30th, 2025.
Is that primarily just for commercial then?
It is actually for residential. So it's for residential.
Commercial photo then?
It
That's why I was confused.
it was just meant to be an illustrative of kind of the potential that parking can take, but it includes mixed-use development as well. But again, staff believes that there are some city goals that strategically eliminating minimum parking can hit, including, again, encouraging density where we would like to see density. Also, opportunities for bike and ped safety in these developments, as well as some environmental benefits such as increasing stormwater quality and reducing urban heat island. So on the left here, you'll see the applicable transit area map. This is the legislative map that has determined where minimum parking will be eliminated. So we have our 2 transit stops at downtown and Mineral Station. We have the Broadway corridor, and then a good portion of downtown and Federal and heading north on Federal Boulevard are also impacted by this. So again, this legislative requirement removes minimum parking for multifamily, mixed-use multifamily and adaptive reuse projects that are located near a high-frequency transit stop. And the state has defined that as any transit stop with active or planned bus or light rail service of a frequency of 30 minutes or more. The city does define multifamily as 5 or more. I have spoke with folks at the Department of, they're DOLA, I forget what the A is.
Affairs.
Thank you, thank you.
It's local affairs, sorry.
We appreciate that.
Good job, Robert.
We can have more time in. So we did speak with the Department of Local Affairs on kind of how the state is looking at multifamily, because this bill doesn't define it and the state looks at it in different ways depending on which bill you're referencing. And they are really just kind of relying on the local municipalities for that definition. And so we define it as 5 or more units. So through this bill, units of 1 to 4 are left out of, there would still be parking minimums applied to those projects. And we think that expanding this exemption to all residential developments that fall within that map area kind of balances the equity here. Because if you want to build 4 units, but you're struggling because of the parking requirements, you can. But if you want to build 5 units, we suddenly don't have that issue. And so we do think that it's kind of a barrier of entry for certain housing types as well as some of our smaller developers.
And that's just for new construction?
For new construction.
You said map area, is that the corridor? What does that mean?
That would be that blue buffer that you see.
Yeah, all the area there.
Circled areas around.
That was landscaping or something. Lavender plants.
I think also, before we dive into this aspect, we have one other question on the next slide as well.
We do. And so the bill does carve out an option for municipalities to adopt minimum parking at a 1-to-1 ratio, so 1 space per unit, for affordable housing projects or with projects that have 20 or more units. But there's a lot of reporting and data that's supported by that. This isn't really staff's preferred. We think that it would really impact our affordable housing partners at
Right.
SMHO.
Against our IHO basically by requiring or parking for when we're giving
Yeah, there would be
parking
some,
incentives.
yeah.
Seems like it's the opposite.
Yeah. That's why they're not recommending it.
Right, we're not recommending it for a few reasons. One is the IHO, the other is that it is quite labor intensive on the city. The city has to prove out that the area doesn't, or that the development needs that parking. And so there'd be quite a bit of analysis that would have to go in, there'd be annual reporting requirements. There's a lot more that goes into it when we already have items in the IHO that would that already address parking, correct?
You wanna go back to the previous slide here and then any discussion on the exempting all residential versus just 5 or more units as required?
Yeah, alright.
Yeah.
Just so I'm understanding here, units or like multifamily, mixed use multifamily, these projects that have more than 4 units, theoretically needing more cars, they're exempt. But a smaller development, 1 to 4 units, that theoretically needs fewer cars is not exempt. That doesn't make any sense to
State
me.
that 1 to 4 is not multifamily, that's more just single family duplexes.
Our code defines multifamily as 5 units or more. And so, anything less than that is is considered something different.
Okay, I guess I'm pointing out, this doesn't make any sense to me that
We
this.
agree, which is.
Yeah, right, yeah, exactly.
It felt like the state was very deferential to local jurisdictions and again, how they define multifamily. Some define it as 2 or more, others kind of have a larger threshold. But we would agree, it doesn't really, that equity is definitely out of balance here for developers that are looking to do maybe a duplex or a 4-unit townhome versus maybe somebody that wants to do just a 5-unit complex.
I think we need to have parking. They gotta park somewhere, and this idea that they're gonna all be taking a bus or a light rail or something like that, I think is a dream. So, once again, we're inundating our neighborhoods with more cars and with.
These are corridors, not the neighborhoods.
I understand, but once
Do you?
again, I do understand. I know along Broadway, down through here. I get that, but once again, we're inundating our neighborhoods with by not putting restrictions on parking.
Again, it's not neighborhoods, it's corridors.
I understand.
You see neighborhoods, but it's corridors.
Neighborhoods, there are houses on South Broadway, are there not?
Okay, but
Yeah.
you're making it seem like it's encroaching inside.
There are neighbors that have homes on South Broadway, neighbors that live right down here. So you wanna call it a corridor, I think it's also part of a neighborhood.
Yeah, so if there was, so the parking is a problem for the apartments that are next to the King Supers on Broadway, right? There's a lot of affordable housing there, and the parking there is very crowded now. And I think that's within the corridor, because it's a block to Broadway. So if that area was, it's built, it doesn't matter, it would only matter if that got redeveloped. If that got redeveloped, then it would probably no longer be affordable, and so the redeveloper would determine how many parking spots, the developer would determine how many parking spots they put in.
And if I can provide maybe one little point of clarification here, so.
Yeah.
The legislation basically says that we can't require them to have parking. It doesn't mean that they won't provide parking, it just means that we wouldn't provide those minimum parking requirements. So for the majority of single-family, multifamily developments, they rely on the market to tell them how many parking spaces they need. You know, apartments specifically, they know exactly how many units they have, exactly how many parking spaces they need, it's what they do. Same thing for some of the smaller developments as well. So, if you have a parcel in downtown and you don't provide parking and somebody can't provide parking, has 2 cars, they're not gonna buy there, they're not gonna lease there, they're gonna go find someplace where they can do that. So the market somewhat drives the need to some extent, so I just wanna be clear on that, it's not that we're saying, it's really that we can't require it. They can make the choice to have it and incorporate it as a part of their development, but it's their choice, not the city's.
Same goes for commercial. I mean, those folks know exactly how many parking spots that they need, and if they can't get a building with that many spots, then.
So Matt, if you're saying it's not required, why would they even care then? I mean.
They wanna be able to sell the units, if
They gotta
someone
sell
has a
them.
demand for parking, they'll put it in there.
People need to park.
Yeah, exactly, but if the city's saying, no, we don't care.
Well,
I
they're
mean,
not gonna all of a sudden have someone who wants to buy a place who's like, well, I guess we'll just get rid of my car.
I agree, yeah.
So they're saying the market is demanding parking, so they'll build parking, right?
It's that current parking minimums tend to be excessive, and they tend to not have a good grounding in factual research. And if you ever get the chance, I would highly recommend that everybody go and read the textbook that is The High Cost of Free Parking. But these parking minimums, they often come out of nowhere. And so rather than saying like, hey, this is gonna be a luxury development and, so we're gonna do 2 cars per spot versus this is gonna be a lower mid-income rental. And, these families might only want 1 car, right? The idea too is to not necessarily assume everybody wants to pay for 4 parking spots for every unit. I think when you look at current parking minimums, it's 2.5 spaces for like a 2-bedroom unit or more. It's something. Was that?
1-bedroom unit's 1.5, 2 bedrooms 1.5, I think it's 3 that gets it.
Okay. Yeah. So there's a cost that you're already that when you put in a minimum parking requirement, you are telling people that they have to pay for parking regardless of whether they're going to use it or not, right? So the idea is that maybe people want to spend more money on the house rather than the parking spot, and we should give them that option. And developers know their market. They do, because they're not gonna, they're not gonna be able to sell these units, they're not gonna be able to rent these units when nobody has a place to park, right? Or they're, people are gonna have to make trade-offs, but.
Have you ever been to Chicago?
Andrew?
I mean, look at the parking around that Chicago, or just around those brownstones and stuff like that. You park 2-3 blocks away.
Look at when the
Parking
brownstones
will
were built,
happen.
nobody had
It
cars.
funnels into the neighbors. That's what I'm getting at. is-
Andrew, then Dave.
Real quick, I think we're having an esoteric discussion on whether the values of parking requirements, the state is telling us we can't have them. So.
Well, I guess what we're debating is to expand on that too.
Yes, but I think just is our parking requirements a good thing or a bad thing? The state is saying that we can't have them, so I think expanding, that's a discussion to have, expanding that to 1 to 4, but we don't have a choice in having minimum parking requirements.
Dan?
I would say the most compelling argument for this is that basically the big guys are getting the advantage, the little guys aren't. That's a pretty clear-cut thing. This is gonna be Dan getting on a soapbox a little bit here. This is where 2 things that we want are bumping into one another. In that we want affordable housing, we want to increase those things. One of the reasons that I support things like the, duplexing and things like that is because in a lot of Littleton, we actually have a lot of on-street parking that's available. Some of these developers that come in here will depend on that on-street parking to provide the parking for it. It is what it is. The other thing at play here is if we want complete streets, on streets that we don't have space for them, there's the thing that will suffer, the thing that will be, what is the trade-off, which is the code for sacrifice, is gonna be the on-street parking. It's just going to be. The only other way I can think about this is maybe one-way streets could do it. But, so you've got two things that are basically doing this to one another. And some of this also sort of ignores the biggest sort of data point that like roughly 94% of people have at least one vehicle. And if the developers are good developers, they will account for that. But they may depend on that on-street parking, which then, if we take the on-street parking, that just compounds a problem that's already there. That was possibly already there and makes it worse. And that's just, it's an interesting dilemma to be in, I suppose, as far as, what are we going to do? And it's not, this isn't, I know you said it was just the corridor. This goes, looks about 2 to 3 blocks off of that corridor, which could still be considered the corridor, but there's still, in many areas on Broadway there, you're starting to cut into neighborhoods for sure. So.
I mean, Cherry Creek, Cricket's a great example, all right? Let's look, yeah, that's a corridor, but that parking is really affecting that neighborhood. Same with Littleton Brewery, they'll do the same exact thing. You're asking, I understand it's commercial, but you put a multifamily in there now, all of a sudden, it becomes the same issue, just with people staying longer. So it's an issue.
Do we regulate parking single-family homeowners in terms of the number of cars that they have both on or off property currently? Anywhere?
Or parking spots.
Parking in general. So we, most single-family homes have, at least garage parking and driveway parking for, let's say 2, maximum 4 if they
Some
want to
front
purchase
yard
their cars. But we still have parking on public streets from single-family home neighborhoods. So the idea that people are fully compacted onto their own parcel with the current setup that we have is also just not happening.
Correct. Were you asking if single-family homes have a parking requirement?
Oh, no, I was saying a restriction on parking or the number of cars in terms of the use of, it was a bit of a facetious question, I'm sorry. But what I'm saying is that we currently don't regulate this for homeowners that want to have 3 or 4 vehicles, park a boat, park an RV. I think if we were really worried about the lack of.
HOAs limit that.
Yeah, ish, But if we were really worried about it, we would be able to crack down on the 99% of the homes that are using public streets for parking. This is a drop in the bucket comparatively speaking.
No, because they have room for parking. These people may not. They may have room for 1 car.
Sure.
When they have 2. Usually in a single family home, you have room for more than 1
But
on your property.
the only question that we're being asked is whether we want to expand the exemption to 1 to 4 units.
Sure.
That's
We can go around.
that's the only question we're being
Give
asked.
a thumbs up or down on it.
So I'm guessing Steve is
Oh,
thumbs
yeah,
up.
don't speak for me.
I'd just like to ask, just from a staff perspective, are there concerns with your ability to negotiate on a site plan when, especially in the 1 to 4 units? Are you hamstrung by no minimums? Like somebody comes in and you ask them, well, where are you gonna park? And they say, well, we don't have to. How do you, is there a concern from a site plan approval for the smaller units?
Currently, there isn't really a negotiation. This is the code. So at this point in time, we don't really have that. I agree that I think a lot of Littleton has some robust on-street parking capabilities. This is along certain locations, for instance, the transportation node down at Mineral Place. Probably not gonna see a lot of single-family development down there as it is right now. When you look at Broadway, Federal, there may be some potential for it. And in those locations, right now, in downtown, you already can account for, in certain, not all the downtown zone districts, but in certain ones, you can already account for those on-street parking spaces towards your parking count. So I
With
think
the
that
expansion, we're talking about all districts, right? Not just those corridors.
Just the
corridors. Just developments of 1 to 4 units
Just
in
the
those
1 to 4
corridors.
units.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry,
This is
not
so small.
not expansion citywide, expansion on those areas, so.
But
thank you for the
it would apply to single-family houses built on the corridor. Someone,
It would, and if I could.
Yeah.
So one thing we didn't really talk about here is the existing zoning that overlaps with this. We have a lot of CM and all of our downtown zone districts and some NC that are impacted by this. These are the ones that we aren't seeing a whole lot of these smaller developments happening here. We are seeing these larger developments, and that there is larger development potential where minimum parking is being exempted. But there is certainly more possibility, I would say, in some of the downtown as well as along Broadway to see more single families that maybe are struggling with parking and would like to renovate in some way that maybe would trigger parking requirements from us, or otherwise duplexing a house where it's allowed. But it is largely happening in our most dense zone districts, or the ones that have the opportunity for more density.
Where are you? You're no on this. You said that. You literally said that before.
I mean, it doesn't make any difference, I mean, if you're getting rid of parking, you're getting rid of parking, so I don't make sense. If you do it for the large ones, you do it for the small ones.
I think I'm with Pam.
I'm with Pam too.
So to go with the exemption and just say there's no requirements
Yeah,
on the board?
if you're gonna do it for the large, it makes no sense, but yeah.
Likewise, with a little bit of a comment here, I mean, like, if one of the things we are looking at trying to achieve as a city and community is to get more units. If a developer is looking at developing a plot of, like, all they gotta do is put one more unit in, and now they're not required to put parking in. So there's a little bit of a, like, clash of some of our ideas here, if I'm making sense.
Yeah, to set up it would incentivize a 5 or 6 unit versus a 3 or 4 unit.
Bingo, yeah.
Which at 5 would.
Oh, well, yeah. Regardless, I'm in favor of this. It doesn't seem fair to have this distinction, so I'm in favor of it.
I would like to make the observation, if they go to 5, it kicks in IHO as well.
Yeah, that's what he said.
Just said, sorry.
Yeah, well, I was wrong. Won't be the first time. Or last time.
I think we got enough on that.
I was gonna say, it would actually be fine the other way if you classify 1 to 4 as not multifamily.
Let's go to the next one after that.
All right.
I think we got direction on this request.
This one I don't understand.
So then the final legislative bill that we'll be discussing tonight is non-functional turf, SB 24005. This one does have a little bit longer of a lead time. It is effective January 1st, 2026. And this does apply, so this is, the state has defined functional versus non-functional turf. And I think it's important to probably start this there, which is non-functional turf is turf that is largely aesthetic, looking to just fill a space. Functional turf is turf that is used for recreating, civic uses, so really, your parks, your fields, those are functional. For commercial developments that just want to have a strip of grass in the front, because that's just what's easiest, that's not functional. And so the state has identified really it's really just environmental goals, so reducing water consumption, mitigating the impacts of urban heat island, as well as improving the water runoff quality. But again, I think that this bill does also intersect with some goals of our own, including helping support local pollinators, and being able to respond to environmental needs or crises as they arise. So this legislative requirement does not allow the new installation of turf, including artificial turf, as well as invasive species on non-residential properties, and it does exempt residential properties. Staff has identified perhaps expanding this requirement with a little bit more strategy than what the bill is currently asking for to residential properties. We can discuss whether that would be residential across the board, or we can look at doing multifamily. I will say that the state legislature right now is already looking at an amendment to this bill to include multifamily properties in this non-functional turf bill. So currently they are exempted, but next year we may be looking at an amendment.
I have just a quick question, so, if you were building like a sports field, baseball or soccer field, right? Could you put in artificial turf?
I think according to the bill you can, our code, I think we could be a little bit more limber with on that. We do have, our turf is permitted only according to director discretion.
There's also,
There's power.
there's much more
It's
specific
real
specifications on the kind of turf that gets installed as well.
Yeah,
So we have native turf options that are.
Oh, yeah, I think that's important to remember as well, that, yeah, this doesn't limit, things like buffalo grass, which is another sod-forming native turf, is completely okay, under this still. What I'm wondering about, right, is and I don't know that this is really a concern, cause again, I don't know what kind of facilities Littleton has or is planning to put money into or redo or anything any time in the future, but there's a lot of really adverse environmental effects regarding artificial turf. It can create heat stress for athletes and put their health at risk. So I'd kind of like to see it go a step further and say just no artificial turf. Especially, or at least at outdoor recreation facilities, maybe indoor recreation facilities could be a different story. Not that we have a lot of those either, but that would be the one that would be the opportunity to go beyond that I think we could probably consider. And I don't know that it would have a big impact again, because I don't know that we've got a lot of those projects, but.
But as somebody who voted to put artificial turf at Littleton High School, at Euclid Middle School, and at, I think, one of our elementary schools, I would have a hard time supporting that policy.
I'm not saying we're gonna go tear it out right now.
But
I'm just saying I
as
wouldn't
a-
put it back in, but
when
it is more stressful for athletes, it creates greater risk of injury, so it's not a good thing to put it in at schools.
That's not necessarily true anymore, because there are so many new synthetic turf products. My husband and I own a sports field design company, and when he designs, they do both natural and synthetic, depending on, what the uses are for the field, but there's so many new kinds of turf out there that would not be dangerous.
Yeah, a lot of talk. So what Senate Bill 2405 did is it said that local governments can't allow for the installation of artificial turf, among other things. So at institutional, it's prohibited. At commercial, it is prohibited. So you can't place that in a lot of.
Only in non-functional areas though.
Correct, yeah, like on a playground, you theoretically could.
Or the football field.
Or where you-
softball
where you-
field or-
substituting a
Yeah.
functional area.
But
So is the soccer field non-functional then?
No,
I
a
wouldn't
soccer
think so.
field
It's definitely functional.
is functional,
Yeah.
and if I could, Kelsey isn't here tonight, but grounds manager Kelsey and I have talked about this. We don't really have standards for open space in our code. Just carte blanche, we don't have those standards. And so we have talked about, particularly as it is that we don't maintain most of our parks, we are really relying on South Suburban, is that when it comes to installation of new grasses and things like that, in these functional areas versus non-functional, we're kind of having those conversations with Public Works and South Suburban right now, and that this bill wouldn't really impact that. That if the turf needs to be, ripped up and put back in for any reason, this bill wouldn't exempt that, and we're hoping to keep our parks kind of out of that discussion, at least for the time being, as we are kind of re-engaging South Suburban in some of these discussions, but also knowing that we do have some park planning professionals that we can rely on for these discussions. But parks are largely exempt from this bill.
So the expansion you're asking us to consider is not allowing turf in new residential properties. And if I'm understanding this correctly, non-functional turf includes front and backyards? How is, because that feels like the key issue is how we define
I think
functional
we have
versus.
some ability to be creative there. The state certainly is not directing us for residential, not at this time. And Reed, please correct me if I'm wrong, what I've seen coming out from state legislature this session is an amendment to include multifamily in that non-residential, not single family.
I think that to Pam's question that you emailed, like, what is that, I think, like, other cities that did it, I think, was it Aurora that said, you know, was it 500 square feet in their backyard is considered a functional space, but nothing in the front yard is functional for turf.
Right.
And so I think that would be more on if we did do that to define what functional is in the residential realm.
Right.
And to follow up the question that I sent you, I'm still unclear on redevelopment. If somebody scrapes,
It would be, so it is the installation of new. It's not necessarily linked to just development or redevelopment as we would think of it. It might not be tearing down a building to build a new one would trigger that. It might just be the ripping up of sod. And once that is out, you are now kind of under newer regulations.
It's not just a scrape. So my neighbor, we have a house in my neighborhood that has, the people who live there, all the grass died. So they're gonna have to replace whatever turf is there. It would fall under this regulation, the replacement of the turf, not because they scraped the house, but because they don't have any turf there now.
It would be for re-landscaping, so not necessarily redevelopment. It applies to just the new installation of.
And specifically for sod, or is that for grass seed as well?
I mean, just we want to make sure that, I'm still not terribly clear that if somebody scrapes a house that did have yard there, even if it died, that they can replace it so it's consistent
No,
with
well,
the rest of the
that's the question in front of us is, will we
Well,
allow them to replace it?
I think we should. I mean, maybe in a new development, you can have different standards, the 500 in the back and nothing in the front. But if you have a current house, I think you want to keep it consistent with the look and feel of the rest of the neighborhood and not require the scrape house to not
So
put a
you-
front yard in.
So you're not in favor of expanding the requirement to existing houses or existing buildings?
Correct. I mean, multifamily's on the table. And new developments, I understand we have water issues, you know, and non-functional areas are using water that could go to other places and we have a limitation and we get to the point where we have to, you know, we're like, when you go up to the northwest and all their lawns are dead because they don't water their lawns, because they don't use water.
Dan, and then, was it Dan or Craig? Did you have something, Dan? Craig, and then.
Just the landscape architect at the table, I have to weigh in on this, because I think any policies that we could put in place to conserve water, reduce bluegrass, which is very water consumptive, would make Littleton a more sustainable place. The challenge here, and I think we have to take this slowly and not just jump into it, is that most people, especially at single-family residents, don't know how to manage native plants, and if they're not managed, they look awful. And so the city would have to have a really robust enforcement of code, what it looks like. You know, how long does the grass get? You know, how is it maintained? How often is it cut? It's not like bluegrass where you mow it every week or you hire somebody to do that. That's easy. Bluegrass is really easy. So to put in native grass, I think if we had something that would encourage that and have some structure around it, defining functional areas, I think is really an important part of that. And, you know, how much of the front yard should be bluegrass, or how much of the backyard can be. You want to encourage families to live. They use those areas. There's use. They're functional in some ways. But I've seen places like at Ravenna. I just did a landscape plan out there. They only allow 500 square feet of bluegrass turf on a 1 acre lot. That's really hard to find a spot where you can actually functionally use it because it's tiny. So you
It's
can
not
go
half of an ADU at this point.
So.
I was gonna say, I think it does, you know, rather than just expanding the requirement, you know, kind of carte blanche, that, you know, I think Aurora took a long time with theirs, with their revisions and their water, and so is Fort Collins, and so is, you know, are many of these jurisdictions. I think it's well worth taking the time, and like, we can either put it to planning and environmental stewardship, or a combination of the two, to kind of come up with like what would make the most sense in terms of new or redeveloped properties or replanting scenarios, and have like a more kind of fully thought out plan rather than just an outright ban, even though my heart says the outright ban. I hear what it, you know, like truly like this, and I think it would be really hard for folks if it was just, to Craig's point, like just done full blown.
And there's also new types of sod that are very low water use too, that look like bluegrass.
And I think we can get like very specific, because we already have actually a pretty good, you know, last update of some of the public works code, you know, in terms of like what plantings can or cannot be used in terms of that turf grass application, planting applications. So I think it's well worth expanding on it.
But I think you're also saying go slow, and
I think just study it, not necessarily
So
make a
don't
decision
expand it
tonight.
by, what was it, July first is the?
yeah. No, this one goes to January 1st.
January 1st, we have a timeline adoption to show you all, but we are hoping to kind of have all 8 of these that you'll be seeing tonight wrapped up by June 3rd. So, but we certainly do hear you all, and that maybe this is something that we can take a look at for a later update, and really kind of ensure that we can be very thoughtful and not have some unintended consequences along the way.
So Andrea spoke to that there is currently a House bill circulating to include multifamily. That is true. They consider multifamily to be 14 or more units, so it doesn't meet our definition of multifamily.
Okay.
That is actually passed the House on third reading, so that's going to be over in the Senate. But essentially, it would prohibit the non-functional turf in.
Yeah, and that also, to me, suggests we shouldn't try to get ahead of it on this one, because the legislature's gonna move the deck chairs anyway, so.
Until council takes a position that they are interfering with the city's home rule ability
We've got at least one vote for that.
adopts a
Listen, I think-
resolution
I don't think
opposing
we're- I
any
don't think
such
I'll be the
things.
only council person across this country or across the state that would be thinking this way. I think a lot of cities are gonna stand up to the state and say, no, it's not right for our community. So, I hope that's what happens.
So I think what we're hearing is that we're supportive of maybe having a future conversation around residential as it relates to this issue and just move forward. as
But not putting this
legislation.
in for the June-ish update.
But we will move forward with the
Yes, these are-
non-residential.
Right, because we kept it.
Right.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
for
That was not a
June-
discussion item.
For June, and not waiting until the.
Yeah, we'll follow the law.
That shit's tricky.
Could I also mention? Thank you, guys.
Alright, I think it actually seems a little backwards to have multifamily not have any grass when multiple families could benefit from like one small area that kids could play or whatever, but
That would be
Seems
functional.
like
That'd be
that's-
functional.
even if it's not a park.
If it's used for recreating, and not installed for aesthetic purposes,
Okay, I don't know what I would do without my grass, we play on both front and backyard all the time. But also I would say, I really think it's important that we have this conversation with South Suburban. I was super disappointed with the Kingsbridge Park plan, and there is so much sod that nobody plays on out there. And they, to Craig's point, know how to maintain it and could do something more interesting. So, I think that's actually really important.
thank you all for the discussion. So we have another 4 more that we can go through. And these are going to be our non-legislative ULUC updates. A lot of these are just some smaller cleanup items, as well as just kind of some thoughts that staff has had for how to streamline process.
So just, for clarification, non-legislative, things that are not dictated by the General Assembly, things that you were planning on doing anyways, but you're lumping them together because we're doing this ULUC.
Exactly.
I'm just clarifying.
Thank you. So the first would be doing some amendments to our plotting, both in criteria as well as process. So staff has had some issues in our criteria for preliminary plats, requiring conditional approval, some circular criteria, that points us to subdivision requirements, that points us back to compliance with zoning, which is what we would like to maintain. But we have had some plats come through that would be redevelopment with existing buildings on them. And we just find it would be cleaner if we were able to kind of make that criteria a little bit more clear, that we are looking also to the potential of redevelopment of lots and not need to conditionally approve preliminary plats that we would otherwise just approve. And then we have really our kind of process improvements. The first is to reevaluate the city's role in condo platting. My understanding is prior to the new code, we weren't looking at condo plats because they're very specific to state statute, and that the county was looking at them. With the 2021 update or adoption of the ULUC, it brought condo platting back to us, and that is, just to make it clear, we're not really looking at lot lines when we're looking at condo plats. It's the division of an existing building or even a proposed building, but it's the division of the interior with some shared common areas. We would still take a look at any application that had any impacts to site development. Condo platting often does not, and it just doesn't really, the city hasn't really found a nice role in that review. And then additionally, we would like to take a look at our criteria for preliminary plats to consider removing the requirement for right-of-way dedications when dedication was already contemplated in city adopted plans, such as the transportation master plan. Our preliminary plats do have public hearing component at Planning Commission. However, we have had plats where the only criteria was that right-of-way dedication when contemplated in the TMP. So the TMP had already been adopted. It might be just a 4-lot subdivision with that dedication required. And we still have required a public hearing for that.
So that's basically a foregone conclusion that there's.
Yeah, I think a good example of this would be Little Raven Elementary. They had a portion of their the road that was located on private property, and so staff had requested that they dedicate right-of-way to make sure that road was all within public right-of-way. And so we then also were kind enough to require them to go through a public hearing process to do that. So, I think from our perspective, when those things are, the city is asking for them and they benefit a public purpose that's already been identified in an established plan, that it makes a lot of sense to put, an applicant through the cost to do that when it's really the city has already said, hey, we want this.
Is there any, so it says, is it only when it's been contemplated in the TMP, or, because wouldn't any right-of-way dedication be at the request of the city?
It traditionally would. So I guess another example would be the corner of Ridge and Prince, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there was a transportation improvement identified at that intersection. That was a 4-lot subdivision. Otherwise, they would not be required to go through a preliminary plat process, but for the dedication of that right-of-way to serve the city's purpose of implementing the TMP requirements. So
my question is, for all right-of-way dedications or only ones that are contemplated in the transportation master plan?
Or other adopted city plans.
Anything above 5 lots or more, it's required to go through preliminary platting process anyway. So this is predominantly for the smaller ones that are under 4-lot subdivisions.
I'm just trying to think of what right-of-way dedication.
If there's a parks master plan, or if there's I'm trying to think of another example. If we end up coming up with some right-of-way dedication needed for Safer Streets initiative by a plan that is adopted, that we would want, and a developer comes in and develops one of those lots, and it's for a commercial purpose, but the only dedication they have is the right-of-way to benefit that public project. We would say that they wouldn't have to go through the preliminary plat process for that, because it's benefiting an overall adopted plan.
Right. Question is, what right-of-way dedication would have to go through it? Because all right-of-way dedications.
Do we need the qualifier?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Do we need the qualifier? Would just all right-of-way dedications are administrative and don't need to go through it? That's what I'm trying to say. Is there a scenario where a right-of-way dedication would still need to go through the?
Yes, so I would say if you've got a project that, let's say it's along the mineral corridor and minerals right-of-way width is 110 feet, and that specific parcel only has there's only 90 feet of right of way there, and so they have to dedicate that additional 20 feet of their parcel to be able to, for future land use if necessary. We would traditionally require them to dedicate that, they would still need to go through the preliminary plat process. Does that make sense?
Or if there was a new public road being created, that would go through, if it was more than just the addition of some right of way on the border. If it was a brand new road, then that would definitely come through, for public.
Any other questions on plating?
So what's the conclusion? That it has to tie to a plan or not necessarily, as long as the city asks for it?
I think it would have to tie to a city's plan
There has to be
adopt,
some
yes. Yeah. Yeah, and just to be clear, I think we might need to go through a policy discussion as it relates to this, because I don't think we would traditionally list implemented plans in the code language, right? Because the titles of those plans can change. And so we would need to figure out the dance to do to make that language clear so that it aligns with that expectation with council.
Do some broad categorization for the types of plans.
Yeah.
I'm confident we can smoke up that language.
Okay.
All right, thank you. The second is an amendment to our notice of mailing. This would shift only the requirement from staff to the applicant for mailing notices for neighborhood meetings. Currently, our code requires the city to do it. We are proposing to build some flexibility in there so the city can do it, but the applicant may also do it on their own. On occasion, we have some applicants that would like to kind of speed up the process to get to neighborhood meetings. We have a 3-week minimum lead time, but if you can make your posting within 10 days and still meet all of our requirements, we think that there's some possibility there to have the applicant do the mailings themselves. This would not impact the radius or who is noticed. It is really just the process of noticing itself.
The city would still provide the GIS list of addresses that are required. The city would still require the applicant to prove that the mailing notice period was met and all those requirements were met. There's ways to do that through the postal service. There's ways to do it by the city receiving that notice. So none of the overall requirements change. It's just that we give the flexibility for applicants who want to be able to move a little quicker to be able to produce those on their own and get those notifications out.
Applicants are already paying for this and will continue to pay for it. It just allows them to speed up the process if they so choose to.
Yeah, so how it works currently is staff does all the mailings, does all the work, and then we calculate that cost and we are reimbursed by the applicant for those actual costs of providing that. So this just would mean that they would do that, provide those costs up front. Questions?
Well, I mean, great, I don't have any questions about this. I feel like the question that has been put before us in the past year is more about the radius. And I heard you say that's not what we're talking about, but radius feels like what I've heard people raise concerns with us about.
And, the city attorney might wanna chime in on this, but the radius of that is, for some of these, it's not even required, this is something that the city has, we're not required by actual law, we could get rid of it, the neighborhood meeting and the mailing, correct? On some.
That's not what I was suggesting.
I know it wasn't what you were suggesting, I was just saying.
But I think if we wanna have a discussion on the radius, we can also bring it up in a strategic session and housing policy stuff.
That'd be fine. I just feel like radius is what people care about, not who mails them.
And we've heard that 700 feet was standard, but we're hearing from our citizens that more citizens want a broader, larger radius.
But I agree, that's not what they asked us, and I changed the topic, and I apologize.
Yeah, this makes sense to me.
I agree.
And so Jared will provide you all an overview of the master sign plan update that we're working on.
Yeah, so in regards to the master sign plan, this is an item that was always envisioned in the ULUC. However, unfortunately, it wasn't built out. So there are 2 sections of the ULUC that list master sign plan, and then behind them it says reserved. So that's a bit of a challenge for us, because not only do we not have the provisions for the master sign plan that was envisioned in the code, But one of the reasons why it was envisioned in the code is that our current code does not allow for, it allows for multi-tenant signs on a parcel, but does not allow for multi-tenant, multi-parcel signs. So, for instance, I've got some examples for you in the slides, but for instance, it doesn't, right now, contemplate the signs for a subdivision, for instance. Something that master sign plan can do, it can allow for specific locations, those larger multi-parcel signage. Consistent architecture would be a great item to have as well, building some consistency in these larger developments. It can potentially limit the number of signs for developments, and provide for some size parameters, so maximum size for signs. We already have a lot of sign provisions in the code. However, one of the items that we can really look at with this and making a concise and consistent architectural product for development would be right now, any parcel in the development, as long as it was a reasonable, 150 linear feet along a frontage, you'd be allowed a pole, a pylon, a monument, and a wall sign. So what a master sign plan could do is have that consistent architecture and potentially more limitations on type of sign, number of sign, size of sign. Currently, staff is proposing that this be an administrative process because it would have to be a true set-aside process, but with strong guardrails. So we want those maximum sizes. There are other communities that do master sign plans in different ways. This is what staff would be recommending. Current code, as I mentioned, the multi-parcel signs are not allowed. And allows for individual parcels to have so many signs. And then the maximum height right now varies based on the sign type. So your monument sign is 15 feet tall. Your pole sign can be taller, or I think it's a similar size, but it's also tied to the height of the building. And then your pylon sign can be higher, but it's also tied to the height of the neighboring building. So what staff would be proposing would be to bring forward guidelines that if a developer, with council and planning commission's approval, but if a developer met those guidelines, that they would be able to move forward with that sign plan that's comprehensive across the area. The other thing that this does is some of the larger subdivisions, commercial subdivisions in particular, have parcels that may not have quite the same amount of visibility on to main corridors. And this would allow those multi-parcel signs to have visibility for other units that may not be directly adjacent to the roadway. I'm gonna go through a couple of examples. This is Johnstown Plaza, this is up north. So they really focused on branding in the monumentation at entrances of the signs. And then kind of smaller signs that have those multi-tenants on there. But they don't really have much of the subdivision signs that have additional slots for these tenants that are located back behind. This location relies more on wall signage. However, in Promenade at Castle Rock, you can see they do have some signage. I'm not proposing that size, but some signage that is more of that subdivision type signage that is along a main corridor, main thoroughfare. And then the interior has some wayfinding and some other decorative signage that all have that same architectural feel. So lastly, I discussed this at Plan Commission, and I have a number of takeaways from that meeting on February 24th. The first takeaway is that we had proposed this master sign plan to be allowed on very broadly, but only in 3 zone districts. And when I say broadly, we had a very small minimum size. We had heard that that minimum size was too small and that this should be reserved for larger developments. And when I say larger developments, it's not just what's being proposed or what may come in the future. It's also, this would be potentially allowed for existing subdivisions that may want to refresh or rebrand as well. That's the intent here. So focus on commercial corridors is one of the items. Having those signs, instead of being measured off of just standard linear footage of right-of-way, they would have to be tied to something such as commercial corridors and suburban connectors, which are found in other documents. And then narrow choices for freestanding signs to monument only was another item we heard. Not allowing for any potential multi-parcel sign to be a pole or a pylon, but to have it be a monument sign. So solid base and then full signage there. Desire to focus on uniform architecture, which is a goal that staff has as well. And then be more restrictive on size and illumination, which is an item that I really want everyone's feedback on. As I mentioned, currently the maximum monument sign is 15 feet. Staff is amenable to keeping it there. However, in our original discussion with Planning Commission, staff had proposed doing a calculation for the number of monument signs that would be allowed throughout a subdivision. And then if you removed one of those signs, you would be allowed a bonus for a higher sign, something of that nature. So kind of what we feel is right sizing for that. We do have some roadways that are in that commercial corridor and suburban connector classification that are a little bit quicker speed, are a little wider, that staff feels we would be amenable to allowing these larger or same size as existing, but allowing for multi parcels to take some of that signage space in regards to. So I tried to hurry a little bit because I know we've been talking through quite a few things, so I'm happy to answer any questions or take feedback.
Questions or comments on the sign?
I know that you just asked us for feedback on the size, but I'm curious about illumination. What's the discussion been around that?
Yeah, so most of the discussion around that was in association with electronic reader boards. But just in general, overall sign illumination, trying to make sure that we have right size that so it is not too bright was the other component to that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's an important aspect. I'm glad that was discussed because there's nothing worse than some huge bright sign light polluting all hours of the day. So I'm happy that discussion was had.
Can someone from the planning commission help me understand why we're focused on monuments versus freestanding signs? I don't understand that.
Apologize, freestanding, monument was a subcategory of freestanding sign. So freestanding sign was monument, pylon, and pole.
Right, so why are we getting rid of pylon and pole? What was the reasoning behind that?
I believe aesthetics.
I mean, we were talking, we had a discussion really about what does Littleton look like and feel like. Pylon signs or poles are often 30 feet tall. You can imagine like a gas station sign with a large illuminated top. You see those kind of signs along a lot of corridors around the metro area, Sheridan, Broadway. You'll see them now. It's really a question of how much do we want that to be the landscape that we encounter around our developments? Do we want it to look like Wadsworth? Monument signs, because they're lower and more architectural, think of the Amway sign at the corner there, that little low. They're still high, you still see them, they're still visible to cars, but they don't lift up into the sky and serve as big. So
it feels like,
it's purely aesthetics.
Yeah, I mean, I think monument signs can be massive and waste a lot of space. And it feels like there's you're conflating two different things, height and type of sign. I can totally see where we don't want 30-foot tall, bright signs, but the flexibility of how the sign is built is a different thing. I'm not, so that, cause I find monuments just to be like the waste of space, like why are we using space on this sign? Cause, so,
And if I could maybe provide maybe just some plain.
unless I'm on the monument, then it's perfect, but other than that, keep going.
Just to be like kind of really transparent with this, I think we have a couple of developments coming in right now that this is very specific to, right? Because of the size of them and the number of commercial uses coming into them. And so both of them provide some level of challenges, right? So we don't want along Santa Fe potentially, 60 signs, right? For each of these individual uses. I think that really doesn't align with overall what we're looking for. But also, I think a key component of this, if I'm wearing a developer's hat, is I want my businesses to be visible, right? I think Littleton wants the businesses to be visible. We want them to be successful, right? Those are key partners in our community. And so we need to find a way to balance those two things. And I think what Jared is proposing and has proposed through his work with our consultant is to find a way to incorporate those subdivision level signages and some wayfinding to highlight some of those businesses that might not be right on the corner of the street, right? It's really hard to miss Costco, right? But, if you've got a smaller business that's off the corner, that is a mom and pop restaurant, we wanna make sure that they're just as visible. We know that they exist and that they're as well, and without putting a giant 30-foot rotating flashy blinky sign. And so I think we're trying to figure out that balance, is how do we get something that not only just that helps kind of maintain that level of character we want in Littleton, but also provide that level of visibility for our business partners.
I disagree with Robert and I agree with what Pat is saying.
What is the question that's in front of us? Is the question in front of us, do you want to continue to talk about signs? Because we obviously can't pass a sign ordinance because we haven't seen it. Okay. And are you asking us to pass the sign ordinance by June 30th? Is that what you're asking us? What are you asking us?
So the ask is, are you supportive of a master sign plan that would allow for multi-parcel signage? Because that's a big gap in our code. And then the second large question basically is, what do you feel right sizing of the size of a sign? And you can indicate that our current code is sufficient, or allowing for something larger you would be amenable to that. Those are largely the two questions.
This is specific only to master development plans. It's not specific, it's not for like the whole sign code. I think, I don't know.
Say master signs code, that covers everything.
Yeah, it sounds like master sign
to
plan,
rule
but
them all.
it's
To rule them all.
master development plans, correct?
Correct.
Just
Well,
wanna make sure that clarification is out there.
yeah, it's limited, we're proposing to limit it to 3 zone districts of substantial size, right? So the CM zone district, BC and IP. Those would be the only locations that we're proposing that this be, people be allowed to utilize the master sign plan.
It's a master development sign plan, basically.
Well, the only caveat to that is there are some locations that have previously been developed through PDs or site plans that I don't wanna preclude by saying only master development. But oftentimes it goes in hand with the master development.
One other thing I would say is, let's change the name a little bit, because it's very confusing to say master sign code. It looks like we're looking at all of our signs throughout the city wide, and so if there was some terminology we can.
Multi-development,
It seems to me we need more examples and more information on what we're giving direction on with respect to the multi-signs and the maximum height. I mean, kind of what is it going to be?
Yeah, I
It's just
think
not enough information to give direction, in my opinion.
I think with the idea, the main thing is to allow multi-parcel signs within a development, because right now, every single apartment has to have their own sign, rather than saying these 6 parcels that are all independent can have one big sign somewhere in the development here.
We think that is better than each parcel having 4 different potential signs, which is what we could face if we don't make a change to the current code.
And you need to do it now because of the pending
Yes.
applications, okay? And this is not a
Soon.
sign over your store or something?
Well, you can have, I won't
You can-
speak for
yeah,
plans,
so-
but you can have
That's
one of
fine.
those, but then several others.
Wall signage could be wrapped into this, more restrictions or allowances of wall signage could also be there. But the main intent of it is for those multi-parcel subdivision entry signs, some people may call them.
Yeah, I think
Okay,
we're.
I'll take back what I said about the example. What about the size?
Yeah, I think what we're seeking some clarification on is council comfortable with us moving forward with actually developing a master sign plan that creates criteria and standards for multi-parcel signs?
Yeah,
And
I'm gonna
so-
say, I'm gonna do my best Robert impression, say, yes, I look forward to the discussion and being educated about what you're proposing here.
Wow.
He's
I-
talking for all of us
I
tonight.
feel
That's what
very erudite there, that was really
Yeah,
good.
we haven't seen the heights or all these things, so I don't think we are I mean, planning had a discussion, we haven't, so I think we would like to have that discussion, but without.
But I interpret what he's saying, that he wants some direction to move ahead so that they can
Yeah.
catch this in time for this.
I'm seeing that
Yes.
there is general interest in
Policies.
moving that way. We need more detail and more.
Yeah, just to be clear, so we have worked with a consultant to get to a point where have to make a decision, right? Do we move forward with this, developing something that is clearly multi-parcel?
Yes, let's move forward.
Yes, I think we heard something maybe slightly different from planning commission, so we wanted, before we spent those resources, we wanted to make sure we were all in alignment.
I have a question. So is this gonna hold up an application until this plan is developed?
It's not our intent.
Not our town.
Very diplomatic.
So is your master sign plan going to include what planning commission is recommending?
Yeah, I think what we wanna do is we wanna get a little bit further into like the development of what the standards and criteria are that aligns with the stuff we heard, right, from planning commission, but also some of the stuff that we've heard for best practice in some of these other communities, and we'd love to bring that back to you for a discussion.
Same direction. Thank you.
No lights at all.
No.
Light free.
Continue.
Just reflective.
And finally, Brent will give an overview of our tree preservation updates.
So glad you made it, Brent.
Wake up, Brent.
Segue to the next item.
So tree preservation, our intent is, in 2023, we brought a forestry master plan to city council and it was adopted. What we'd really like to do is to fold that into the ULUC. And really the big change is that currently the code charges $500 per tree that is cut down. What we'd like to do now is to charge, I believe it's $250 per inch of diameter of the tree. And so that's the big change that we're implementing into the code. The other one is, the forestry master plan talks about types of trees you should plant, invasive species that we won't allow, how to plant trees, and basically just, specifications for the contractors to plant trees, so.
Sounds good.
Well, wait a second.
I'll just read you what I wrote, it's like, I'd like to see us propose that trees are saved if they are mature, low water absorbing, and at whatever cost, rather than just automatically do fee in lieu of, and I'm not sure that I should say automatically. But part of this stems from recent loss of some huge pine trees and different trees, but anyway, that there be more of a conscious effort to preserve the tree canopy and the trees that are on a site. Cause we talked about this quite a bit, and we had presentations around that an inventory was done, and that these trees are healthy, these trees are good, these trees are not good, these are sick, whatever. And it seems that we need a way to put some teeth in that or follow up on that. I mean, I think it's easier just to say, well, just cut it down, pay for it.
Yeah, so oftentimes our current code is pretty lenient when it comes to fee and lieu requirements. So this would bolster that. For instance, right now, our code does require the tree inventory, but it doesn't require mitigation until you hit the 12-inch diameter mark. That's pretty big. That's very uncommon for other ordinances that I've worked with. And so this tree, it's not the plan, city tree manual, excuse me. In aligning the ULUC with it, it actually brings us closer to on par with other communities. It would require mitigation and whether that be X number of trees needing to be planted that would compensate for the larger tree, or for fee in lieu to a much greater extent. Rather than 12 inches, it would start at much smaller, and that'd be incremental by the diameter of the tree.
Where does that money go?
Yeah, it does go into a fund. We've been collecting funds as well to go to our urban forest.
Some of these trees are priceless though.
Well, but I think you're getting into private property right here too.
I
if you're mandating. So I think
understand.
that's a bigger discussion than this is just to update and kind of improve upon the policies that we have, what's required and when. And
I agree, I mean, if a tree is dead, or it's a danger, like we had a tree that we were concerned was gonna fall over, and it was a big tree, I mean, you're getting penalized.
Yeah, dead trees would not be counted. When you do the tree inventory, you have to provide a quality of the tree.
So dead trees, what other kinds of trees might be not qualified for
ugly tree.
One tree on the state,
Often-
noxious weed.
Yeah.
List, I believe.
just a healthy tree?
Yeah, I think emerald or ash is
Well,
one
like
of
a
them.
Russian olive.
Russian olive.
What if you wanna take a tree in your, down in your backyard because you wanna build a deck or some other amenity? You have to pay this
Yeah, I
fee?
don't think this
That-
affects
that
private
doesn't
property.
Oh, this is not private, this is just commercial,
Well, this is for new development.
new developments,
Private
Private
property,
property.
it's still private property.
commercial
It
and
doesn't affect
residential.
existing properties that are not that do not currently have a land use application. So this is for new developments, if there's a land use application to provide.
Like what we saw in Costco.
Change, yes.
Right, yes, so, I mean, if you're gonna cut a tree down in your yard, you don't need a permit from us, right?
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. So what I've heard, I'm picturing citizens coming in dressed as the Lorax and speaking for the trees for Littleton. I think citizens misconstrue this as us like taking money for trees, which is what it is, but is there a better way to explain it to them? I mean, they still have to replant what they cut down, but like, can you
And so
explain?
the intent is to actually, I think this ordinance establishes a tree fund, correct? So we are establishing a tree fund so that we can, I guess, build up our canopy in the long run, right? So part of the forestry master plan is to increase the canopy within the city. And
This
so
is just asking
that's
us to
the
charge
intent
more.
of this, yeah.
Yes.
And expand the scope and
And it's
Yeah,
also
what is being
the-
charged.
Variables that account for those larger more mature trees.
Right.
And the smaller ones, quite frankly, which could
Smaller
easily
ones,
avoid.
Do we go out and check that they're not fibbing on the trees?
Yeah, so I think it's a good point. So like, just like we would require a licensed engineer to design a roadway or do an analysis, licensed arborists have to do these analysis as well. So it's a professional who has to come in, do the tree inventory, evaluate the health of the trees, and provide that report and that inventory that we.
So basically then, excuse me, that tree inventory then could just be, here are all the trees, and so a developer could look at that and just say, okay, this is what we're gonna have to pay for, because we're gonna take them all down. I mean, to me, it's more about preserving invaluable tree canopy. You could plant a new tree all day long, but it's not gonna be a tree that's a 30 or 40-year-old tree.
Yeah, you've got, I think, context for development's important, right? So, I would say most of the time a developer will walk in with an idea for what they wanna do on a parcel, right? And we don't, ask them to sign that piece of paper and get going, right? We want them, we have conversations about these things with them in our pre-application meeting. So we talk about the city's transportation priorities, we talk about preservation of tree canopies, we talk about what our code says, as it says in relation to, things like non-functional turf, water conservation, all these things go into how we communicate our overall organization and community's expectations for land development. And so when those conversations come up, like for instance, a Costco, if they have a very specific project they wanna do, and so when we say, hey, we need you to save as many trees as you can, they do that, they look where that is possible, where can they keep those, and there's somewhere it's not possible. And so sometimes the way a site is configured, those trees were put in a place in a time that was not conducive to what our current land use code would require. So for instance, if you've got trees along the right of way, well, our current code says, well, that's where buildings need to go, right? So we want to pull those buildings as close to the public facing right of way as we possibly can, and currently we can't do that because there's a bunch of trees, and so that we have a conflict there, but we've got to resolve. And so that's the work that our team does in conjunction with a developer to figure out how that's possible, right? So.
We talked a lot about balancing or trade-offs here. It's, if a developer comes in and said, this is what we want, we're gonna have to take down all the trees to say, well, our policy here is that we want to preserve as many trees as possible. So we would like for you, and I understand personal
That's what he
property
just said.
rights. But I know what he said, but that's not what happened. Part of it was, I think too, is in this particular instance with Costco, that we were presented a plant inventory tree, and it made it sound like these trees are going to be preserved. But then when it's actually, the construction started, they're gone, they're just gone. And so I felt like, why did we have that presentation and that information presented to us, and then nothing came of it? It's like, shh, they're all gone. That, so I'm just
Yeah, I
saying.
wanna be clear with one thing with it, so it wasn't Costco, right? They were one of the anchor tenants there, but that was the.
Costco's property there, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're on both, right? So it's on multi-port, so it's Riggs property, right? Republic Investment Group's
Yeah,
development.
we actually never heard anything about Costco. It was all about the residential
I
behind it.
agree, I'm just saying that's the site.
Yeah,
I mean, that you're
just wanna make sure we're being
specifying.
tone.
No, I'm talking
We're
about
not
the
talking
entire
specifics here,
site.
we're talking about a tree preservation policy, we're not looking at a specific site.
I'm not either, I'm talking
That
about
sounds
that
like you.
parcel. But if it happens, I mean, it happens to be the biggest piece of land that's being developed other than Santa Fe right now, I mean, practically.
So are you against having this policy, or are you for it?
I think there needs to be more incentive for developers to preserve trees.
And I think that's kind of the heart of this is there.
Well, it sounds like, I understand you're doing that through financial means, tying into
I mean,
squeeze on,
that's one
but
tool, right? And so anytime we look at all these things, we use different tools to try and help make these decisions. Like, I'll tell you that everybody on my team, right, they love the city of Littleton, they love the tree canopy, they love the trails, they love being outside and enjoying the parks that we have. And so, and nowhere in our organization are we prioritizing the removal of trees, whether for development or a capital project or anything. And so, we always try and take this holistic lens when we look at development. It's what we're obligated to do, is to take that lens when we.
I mean, I think that Sherry's concern, it says prioritize preservation of existing canopy, I mean, right there, and so I think
I
that's.
understand, it's
I
just.
realize it may not be exactly what you're getting at, but I think we're
Well, it is.
on that line.
Can we tighten that up, then if that's what we're gonna say, then can we do,
Is there another tool we can use?
follow that?
He says he said that they talked to him and said, hey, we can look at how you can reconfigure this and try to preserve it.
I think the biggest challenge, I don't know if Reed's got thoughts, but there are private property rights, right? We can't just kind of run and say you have to save every tree, then we run into a situation where the city is probably gonna have to start purchasing a bunch of large parcels, right? Cause we're limiting development to some extent, so we have to find that balance. Yeah, we have to find that balance.
It's where possible, when possible.
Development happen in a lesser way. If the whole area needs to be regraded to do the whole thing properly and improve the infrastructure under the whole thing, then it has to be done that way. It feels kind of touchy-feely to say, can you try and keep this one on the corner? I mean, we also want it to look beautiful and consistent when the whole thing is done, so.
So in the interest of time, can we keep moving here?
That's our final slide.
You have a timeline slide,
Not quite.
and then a thank you slide.
We have a very great thank you slide. You guys are full of focus tonight. So we did just want to present you all with our anticipated timeline. It does start with tonight's study session. In mid-April, we were hoping to shoot for the week of April 8th. Jared and I kind of did some strategizing today. It is likely looking like we'll push that back to the week of the 15th, but publishing our red lines and hosting a community meeting so that we can run through all the changes and be really clear about what it is that we're proposing prior to getting to public hearing. And again, talking about our non-negotiables for state legislation versus our negotiables, whether that be for the legislative updates or the non-legislative. And then we are anticipating taking this to Planning Commission on April 28th, and then seeing you all at City Council for adoption on June 3rd.
With the posting of the red lines, is there any way to stagger it? If you have 3 or 4 of them done, you could post it if you're still working on one of them, and then give it, I mean,
We can certainly talk about that to
don't know if it's a
strategize it.
possibility or not, rather than waiting until the 15th if you have something that's ready to go on the 8th. Just a thought.
I think that's possible. We can work on that.
Yeah. And then otherwise, we did want to thank you all for.
Forgot the best slide, sorry.
Yes, again, full of spoilers tonight. Did wanna thank you all,
Usurper.
and our contact information is on there. Kelsey Stansfield is again really our lead contact for that tree preservation update. It is happening within the ULUC, but it's really just implementing a previously adopted plan that her team really manages. So any questions on those items, please feel free to reach out to any of us.
Questions?
Yes, just really briefly, and I did wanna ask this, it's on my mind. For the, and maybe it's Kelsey that I should reach out to ask this, but for the $250 per, I think it was inch of the tree.
It's a diameter and it's per inch diameter,
Okay.
so if you have a 10-inch diameter tree, then it's what, $2,500.
Okay, is that a standard that we looked at other locations, to say, hey,
Yeah,
they're doing
it's
this?
kind of a middle of the road standard that Kelsey picked, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. You have one? Oh, thank you so much for spending the evening with us here. Let's take a quick break while we rotate out. Thank you, Planning Commission.
Thank you.
We're back here for some
Water discussions.
stormwater infrastructure
Yes.
discussion.
Ooh, exciting.
Manager?
Thank you, Mayor. So I want to just start by telling the story that our water resources manager, Sarah White, started with the city about 2 years ago. She thought she was gonna come in and help us really, manage this water portfolio, all of it, she would do normally.
Step
Build
in the
out a
circle.
stormwater management program over time. And we, were faced with very, very serious culvert failures or sinkholes in the summer of 2023, and those projects have continued through today. So this has really been emblematic of what you hear when you're trying to, fly the plane or build the plane while flying it, or whatever that would be. So we've been doing a lot of work along the way with all of these very, the major culvert failure emergency projects. Sarah has also done the work to look back at all the master plans that we have, look at all the data that we have now that you're gonna hear about, and put together a long-term stormwater plan for us that focuses on the near term, which is where we'll end tonight. I wanna steal just a little bit of the thunder at the end and tell you that the real important next step from a financial planning process is to do an updated rate study. And you're gonna hear at the end, we're gonna need to get your direction on some finite financial steps that we need to take now. But I wanna just kind of start and finish with the need to update this rate study so that we can recover the funding that we need long-term to pay for the needs that you're gonna hear tonight. So with that, I'll introduce Sarah, and Brent. I think Kevin Norton, our budget manager, who's been working to pull all this together. Take it away.
Yeah, I'll just kick us off. I'll try to go through this relatively quickly. I think this journey really began for us in 2018 when we started videoing all of our underground infrastructure. And when we started with the storm sewer, we actually found 40% more storm sewer than we thought we owned previously. And so
We gained assets,
yeah, we gained a bunch of assets that we didn't know that we had, and it kind of puts us in this position that we're in now. So, what we're gonna cover is the state of our infrastructure, floodplain management, the storm drainage enterprise fund, and then a summary of our goals, timelines, and funding needs. And I'll just turn it over to Sarah. She has all the good stuff, so.
Okay. So really quickly, what we have, based off of the inventory that was done in 2018, is that the city owns just over 50 miles, 53.5 miles of storm sewer that is owned and maintained by the city of Littleton. 80.5 of it is total storm, but a lot of it is private or owned by other jurisdictions. Within that breakdown of the 53.4 is 6.5% is CMP, and that's corrugated metal pipe. I will slip into Ackerman, so I apologize. CMP is gonna be something that you're gonna remember here pretty quickly. Corrugated metal pipe has a lifespan of about 50 years. Sorry, I'm very tired. Has a lifespan about 50 years. A lot of that CMP that was installed within the city was done in the 80s, and so we are reaching the end of that lifespan very quickly. If you do remember, I jumped ahead on my slides. Corrugated metal pipe, this is my decoder ring for you. Reinforced concrete pipe is the RCP that I will also slip into a little bit. And then we have some other acronyms that you don't have to remember quite as much, but just in case I say them, a PVC is a plastic, and then HDP is a higher density plastic. The corrugated metal pipe is a 40 to 50 year lifespan, and then our RCPs are a 75 to 100-year lifespan. Also depending on how well we maintain them and if there's any sort of outside environmental influences that come into those as well. Just a quick base reference map for y'all about where all that is. The red ones that are highlighted there nicely, those are all of our corrugated metal pipes. So they are spread nicely throughout the city, kind of concentrated in some areas that, again, were built in the 80s. So,
As somebody who went to high school in the 80s, I'm feeling really, you're making me feel old.
Feeling more out?
Yeah.
Reaching the end of useful life.
What did he say?
Still, never mind, continue.
Please keep going, ignore that.
So, June of 2023, or 3 days after I started, we had a series of storm events that happened in the city, and then we had a series of sinkholes and culvert failures that happened. Yes. Allegedly.
Maybe there's a connection.
There are 4 notable ones that happened that cost the city a lot of money. Jackass Hill Road, Broadway and Jameson, Powers Park, and East Mineral Avenue. I'm gonna touch just quickly on both of those and what those impacts were. So June 12th, 2023 was the last day I slept, and that was the sinkhole at Jackass Hill. We had 2 metal CMPs that caused failures in there. We had the car that went through there. Lots of damage there. That cost us $1.3 million to repair and had that road closed for 2.5 months.
Make the residents pay for that.
The sinkhole that started out very small at Broadway and Jameson during a rain event during June opened up to a 100-foot long, 30-foot deep, and 50-foot wide sinkhole. Most people didn't know about it because it was hidden off in that open space over on the side, but y'all saw the orange fencing that ran along Broadway. So that was a very long process as well. That had more CMP that had failed during that storm system. That cost us $600,000 because it was over in the open space, so we didn't have to repair a lot of the roadway too, so that was nice. 2.5 months, and then only the shoulder closure that happened with that. Powers Park, also not as noticeable because it was a small little sinkhole, but it did cost us $400,000 to repair and close that park for a month and a half. East Mineral Avenue looked just like a small pothole, but what lies beneath caused a sinkhole. There was actually turned out to be 3 sinkholes that went along this whole stretch. One of the mills, one of the construction equipment actually fell into a sinkhole, and then we had another at the outfall. So lots of great things that happened with that project. That cost the city $1.8 million to fix. Eastbound closure was 3.5 months and westbound was 2.5 months. So altogether, those 4 projects cost the city $4 million to replace, and that only replaced 2,000 linear feet of pipe. We currently have another 17,500 linear feet of CMP to replace, or line if we can eventually find some in good enough condition to line. This does not include the 3 that I've dealt with this year, which are small, that's fine. But we've had 16 sinkholes since May of 2023. So once that started, we started to look at identifying and triaging what our infrastructure looks like. And we went through and basically pulled all of the CMP inventory and figured out what was at most risk of, highest risk of consequence failure, and then highest impact to the community, basically. So we prioritized those based on, I had them as high, medium, and low, and then now we have a super high priority because those had to move up a little bit in the list. So our super high priority are marked here, and those are basically our major corridors or major impacts to the city. So along the Broadway corridor, along County Line corridor, Bellevue, and then along Ridge. So we've identified 6 high priority, high risk projects that would need to be completed very soon. Those include Bellevue and Federal, which is currently out to bid, and approximately $850,000. Lee Gulch at Broadway, that is $4 million, and we currently have that as 9 months. We'll get to a little bit more of that in a little bit, but yeah, construction is actually supposed to be starting in the next couple of weeks. Alati south of Ridge, we couldn't even get a camera down most of that line because that line is so bad. That is also a major school route, so that is moved up into our priority list. Ridge and Prince, also that is a school route as well and a major commuting area, so we want to make sure that that one is completed as well. That one we are also trying to do in an off-school timeframe. Stern Parkway is one of my favorites because it also has a CMP manhole, so that's a fun new challenge as well. That's also going to be about just over $500,000 to replace. Just really quickly, I am also talking to Simswa, which is our stormwater partner to the east, about potentially working together to get that one fixed. Broadway at Weber, which is another one that runs underneath Broadway, over by the fire station. So those sum total of those 6 projects are somewhere is just over $7 million to fix those projects. In addition to those, we're also starting to identify medium or high priority, and we have an additional 5 that are on there for just under $4 million. The entire Oak Brick subdivision over by Pennsylvania, or Mineral and Broadway, basically just to the east of that. That whole subdivision was put in with CMP, so that's fun.
That's where I live. I know. You're not Deanna.
I was nervous about Kyle's examples about Aberdeen Village earlier, so it's everybody's.
Replacing these new, with CMP or?
No.
Okay.
No, there will not be another piece of CMP in my lifespan that comes into the city. So if we can reline them, we will do so, but they have to have enough structural integrity in order to align them. So hence some of these pictures where you can see that the pipe is completely deformed. Some of those, maybe we can even do a spot repair on it and then line some of the other portions of it. But unfortunately, where we're at is that they are so far gone that I can't even line some of these. So the slide that you saw earlier in regards to the RCP, the lifespan between an RCP and a CMP was important just because that showed that when I'm trying to replace them with RCP, we're also gaining another 50 years of ideal lifespan on those as well. These projects have also already been identified prior to me coming in, and so those are scheduled to be completed within this year or next year, upcoming soon. That's about $2 million for those. We do have some failures within our RCP, again, things that just haven't been maintained and also need to have some loving care brought to them as well. So those look as small as like patching or ideally lining. We do have visible soil voids in some of them. The picture on the left is fun because there's just no top to the top of that pipe, which is great. And then we do have just general resident complaints that we need to deal with as well, development connections, capacity issues, and then flooding. We did do a wastewater and stormwater master plan in 2023. In addition to the ones that I've already outlined, they also identified 27 immediate projects that were called out there, which included some intersection flooding, localized flooding, and capacity issues. Some of those, we have 7 residential areas that are actually identified in this as well that we'll need to continue to work on.
Locations that failed in 2023 identified in that plan.
The ones that have already failed?
Were in that 2023 plan where they identified
At risk.
is at risk during that.
The Bellevue and Federal and Jackass Hill were identified in there.
You've done a lot of cameraing work since those sinkholes, just that have identified a lot of those others.
Yeah, so the 2023 master plan is actually based off the 2018 videos, and so, you know, that data is already 5 years old, and so things could have gotten worse, you know, since then, so.
Yep, that's a good point, thank you. That master plan identified 17.6% of our infrastructure as very high risk or high risk of failure. So what we have currently is just identified is that we have 6 projects that I personally have identified as high-risk projects, which are somewhere around $7 million. Future high risk future identified high or medium priority is $6 million. And then as a very rough estimate, $10 to $15 million identified from that master plan, those 27 projects that were noted out there. And then still have 3.4 miles that have not yet been assessed or triaged. If we were able to line those completely, we're looking somewhere around $6 million. If we have to do those at full replacement, that's about 3 times the amount to replace that per project. In addition to that, this storm sewer fund also handles floodplain management. So we have just over 1,000 parcels that actually are within or intersect a floodplain. 247 buildings within a FEMA floodplain, and then an additional 281 buildings within a local floodplain. Those differences probably don't mean as much to you, so we'll just say somewhere around 500 buildings within a floodplain. Just a quick reference of where those floodplain maps or those floodplains intersect through the city. We have been developing master plans. Most of our master plans are also a little older, not in the 80s, but a little bit older. So those were all done a while ago and need to be updated. Obviously, things change. Floodplain data changes, so we are working on getting some of these updated. Jackass Gulch is currently in process. Slaughterhouse Gulch, we just did an amendment, or an approval for that, so that one's in process. Lee Gulch will be next year. That will help incorporate some of the changes that we're doing at Lee Gulch and Broadway, and then Little's Creek will also be going through there too. We have floodplain management projects that are currently in place or have been identified. If you live nearby it, Jackass Gulch Channel Stabilization is currently in process. Ridgeview Park Detention Pond has been, we're working on preliminary designs for some of that. And then other projects that have been identified through our CIP plans with Mile High. Highline Canal is also one that is coming through, and so we're both working on funding the design and resource documents in order to get the Highline Canal to where it needs to be. But after that, we also need to consider that we're gonna have some sort of maintenance, and then we're gonna have drainage improvements that are needed based on those recommendations from the management plans. So all of that together means that we need a lot of money, and now I give this over to Kevin.
And let's see, he's here because he found it, and he's got good news.
Find is relative. So as you know, as Sarah mentioned, we have a lot of need and we don't have unlimited resources. So what we're gonna talk about today are these 11 high priority projects. When we put those together, that's about $11.2 million of projects. Of that amount, we have a gap of about $8.7 million in our available funding. So the way we pay for these projects normally is through our storm drainage fund, which is paid for by the storm fees that are assessed to residents that they pay annually. As you can see in this fund, because of these emergency repairs that have been coming up, the fund is beginning in 2023. Those revenues that we receive are not able to pay for those emergency repairs. That fund also pays for all the operation and maintenance as well as these capital projects. In 2023, council authorized a $1.1 million loan to help pay for that from the sewer fund. And so the storm fund is gonna start repaying that loan in 2026. So if we were to plug in the 5 of those projects that Sarah mentioned into our 2025 budget, our total 2025 budget in the stormwater fund is $3.5 million, and so that would create a $2.8 million funding gap. That would feed into 2026 and 2027, and as we continue to plug in those projects. As you can see, the storm drainage fund with our current revenue stream just can't handle those types of major repairs. The rate study that Sarah mentioned will, and that Jim mentioned, is gonna be part of the recommendations at the end. If we were to do that, those revenues we still wouldn't collect until about 2026 to 2027. So we're looking at, we looked at different funding options in order to address these high priority projects to prevent those same failures that happened in 2023. So the three options that we've looked at are, the first one is the standard, which is the state revolving funds, which is administered by the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. These are short-term loans, and there are some grants available that that generally municipalities use to apply to receive money for these projects. However, those take about 8 to 12 months to qualify, and the deadline was in January, and so we wouldn't be able to use that option for these 2025 projects that we have planned. The second option is to do the same thing we did in 2023, which is a sewer fund loan. The repayment would be part of the 2025 rate study, and following the same terms that we use in the sewer fund, which we can actually set our own terms since it's an interfund loan, where we have more flexibility to set our terms. A 7-year repayment beginning in 2027 with an interest rate of 2.5%, which is to pay for that interest that the sewer fund wouldn't be gaining because it's now in the storm fund, would be about a $440,000 repayment. And that's about holding all things equal, about $16 additional annual increase to a single family home in their storm rates to repay that loan over time. I want to caveat, that's a huge estimate. We have to do the full rate study to see what that would be, but that's just holding everything equal to give an idea of how much what that does.
And that's just specifically for the repayment of the loan, not any additional costs or needs in the future, so it.
Correct. And that's on top of, we already had in our 5-year plan that when we came to council in the budget, a 5% increase already, so that's in addition to that 5% increase. So the other option is we can go out and get a bank loan, same repayment. If we roll it in as part of the rate study, if we follow these same repayment offerings, it's about a 4.5 to even over 6% interest rate. And so I plugged in a 5% interest to see what it would look like, and that's really about an additional $300,000 over 7 years. And we would and the shorter terms, higher interest rate, and we would have to go to market, and so that's a little unknown. But at the end of the day, it would be more than what we can offer an interfund loan at 2.5%. So our staff's recommendation is to use the sewer fund loan for the 2025 projects of about $2.8 million, and then apply for the state revolving funds for those additional $5.1 million.
Question, Ken, could you please speak to why it's okay, why we think the sewer fund can afford a loan? What are the circumstances of that fund balance?
Great question. So, as you'll see, the circumstances of the fund balance. So the reason why we think the sewer fund would be able to handle that, because we have, if we were to take I know this is, as a budget person, this all makes sense to me, but I'll walk through it for everyone. So as you can see, right now in the 2025 budget, our ending balance, which is essentially the money we have on hand plus revenues, less expenditures, the ending balance is $8.5 million. If we were to loan that to the stormwater fund, our ending balance would still be $5.7 million. And if we roll that in through 2028, you'll see that as we start repayments in 2027 and 2028, we're rebuilding that fund balance. So the sewer fund is able to handle a $2.8 million loan. Now, as a reminder, we are trying to build this fund balance just because we have some Clean Water Act improvements we have to implement that are pretty large dollar amounts. We don't have the exact number, but we have pretty large dollar amounts coming in the next 5 to 10 years. So we will be rebuilding the fund to address those. But as you can see, the sewer fund has adequate fund balance to handle a $2.8 million loan. And I'm gonna give it right back to Brett.
So
what's our next steps? I mean, our next step is really to continue to evaluate and triage all of our existing storm sewer. Really, we'd like to.
Last time you did that, it cost us a lot of money.
Right.
Maybe just, just don't look, and there's not a problem, right? Isn't that how it works?
That's what I've been telling them.
Services.
So I guess all of our high risk, we'd like to have repaired within the next 2 to 5 years, and all of our medium risk within the next 5 to 10. And we'd like to do it with the combination, hopefully with the medium ones, of doing some lining projects, continue with our floodplain management and master plans, and then obviously the rate studies, the big thing we've got to do next.
Are you recommending as part of this $16 per household rate increase?
Well, I think the rate study will determine what that actually needs to be.
Yep.
Give you a sense for what it could be, but we'll have to build that into rates.
And the current single-family storm bill is $118 a year, if that gives you a reference for that.
And I think Kevin already talked about our recommendations, but we'd like to take a $2.8 million loan from the sewer fund. We would like to pursue a $5.1 million loan from the state revolving fund. And the one thing about the state revolving fund, they can loan us up to 18 million as we find additional projects. So I can see us kind of going back to them maybe multiple times. Yeah, and then obviously complete the storm and sewer rate study, so.
For the revolving, literally what is our process for approving these different things? Or I assume.
Councils, you mean?
Yeah.
Or the city council?
Yeah, council. I assume council can tell you today, do the sewer rate study, but for the other loans, do we have to pass an ordinance at some point for the other parts?
Yeah.
You would have to approve, yes, the application for those loans.
We would require us to retain bond counsel
Yeah.
as well.
For one or for two?
For two.
Yeah, one, I assume.
Tonight,
Yeah, for the state bond.
we're seeking direction to start the application process. You know, the CDPHE is a great partner to work with on these, and there's a very established kind of program. We just think we need to get into that process now so that we can be eligible for funding those 2026 projects. Should council approve that?
I'll just even put a finer point as to why we should get into it now is because the infrastructure bill has actually helped subsidize and create additional money for the state to essentially pull from. So now is going to be the time where we'll be able to get, or at least in the next 2 years, be able to get better loan terms than if we were to wait and push this further out. And so hence wanting to maximize the amount of like the high-end medium projects, like, it doesn't have to be culvert assets, it can be all sorts of things. And the more we can squeeze into this initial loan package, the better off we're gonna be for the next 20 years.
Can we fill a lake?
No.
If that was doing anything to improve stormwater quality, yes.
Okay, just thinking.
So to clarify, number 2, it's a loan from the state.
Correct.
And what's the rate? Is it lower than?
2.2, I think.
3.5, it's about 3.5 to 5% over 20 years. Because it depends how big the projects are too, but.
And you think we're gonna have a bond for that?
No, we have to retain bond counsel for it, but.
We'll have to do some qualification and some rating and those sorts of things to qualify.
This is a loan that we don't have to actually put up any assets as collateral.
Correct.
Allegedly, we still have to pay it back.
Is the 2.8 million
That's different.
all we can do or should do right now? Is that the max? Are you guys recommending the max?
Yeah.
I also can't do like all of the projects all at once, so yeah.
Yeah, it's capacity. There's also, because Sarah also has programmed in other projects that are already in the budget, so.
And I'll just say, the state revolving loan fund program is really the best way to fund these. It's okay that we use the sewer fund for some short-term things because the sewer fund is healthy, but it really shouldn't be our first option for funding these things. We just need to get a jump on the, as much of the emergency work as we can in 2025.
Kind of an emergency situation.
My other question is, does some of this work change some of those floodplains in the city?
So, yes and no. The idea is to be able to do all of these under a no-rise condition, and so that we're not altering any of that. So, part of the reason that Lee Gulch at Broadway hadn't started last month is because we're trying to make sure that we're not having delineation issues that we would need to notify people with. But so far, no, that we haven't had any of that. Any of the work on the infrastructure itself would not. It would be any of the floodplain work that would.
So, I mean, I know Brent knows which one I'm curious about, but I do live in a 100-year floodplain. Well, improving that won't make it change the risks of my property or my neighbors or things like that.
You're talking about down Curtis Street?
Yeah, I think it would improve it.
Yeah, so if we put a bigger pipe down Curtis Street, obviously it would shrink the floodplain, right? It's just whether that's a good use of our money at this point is what we gotta figure out, right?
I think there's one vote for bigger pipe.
So, and then there's also, that one also has the detention pond that goes along with it too, which may help reduce some of that, so, yeah. It's all part of it, so that's why some of these take a lot longer to design and go through too, is just like you have to realize what that implication means for homeowners downstream as well.
All that. I think those are all great recommendations, yeah.
And just to Pam's point, the rate increase, that's probably the bare minimum. It's gonna be more than $16, because you have to build up the fund. I mean, that's one problem, is the fund is so.
Non-existent.
There you go.
What's the rate?
Underfunded, I was gonna
Oh,
say.
yeah, that's the word.
But using this loan program is also gonna even out the rate increases in the future, because we won't be having to do emergency repairs. We'll be able to actually proactively get at those especially medium risk priorities. And so by having proactive relining, we're gonna save what Sarah showed, 3 times as much money in proactively relining. And by the time those have aged into the very unlikely category of repair, all the low and very low stuff now will have aged to the medium category. And we just start that revolving fund again. That's what a lot of municipalities do.
As old as 80s pipes then.
But the goal is also to maintain these as we go along too, so I mean, that's also unfortunately been an issue, is just making sure that we do constant maintenance on it. So that's part of the O&M is a big portion of our future plans as well.
Any other questions? I think you're getting a lot of it saying this looks good. Please fix our pipes.
Trying.
We want
Thanks,
Sarah to be
for
able to
doing this
sleep.
work.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for sticking around, not saying, see, I'm going somewhere else.
Getting through all
So
those
at the end of
slides
this,
so quickly.
Are you tempted to move to the desert where I guess?
Where it doesn't rain as much, yes.
Although they have bigger.
We do have big
floods.
floods. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. City manager update?
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, I do have 3 things to take the time. First thing, I just want to mention, we did shift, this is more for the public, we did shift the time of one component of the council's retreat on Friday. Instead of starting the tour at 1 o'clock, we'll be starting the tour at 1:30. And again, it will start at Republic Plaza. Second thing, I just want to let the council know, so you can start to be thinking about it at your next meeting on the 18th. We'll be hearing a request from South Metro Housing Options for an additional funding request of $500,000. They're trying to finalize their funding for their next community at Montford Flats, and as their funding has finally come together, they're needing to find some of their own money. They're asking us to put a little more of our funding from the IHO with theirs to make that project happen. So that's a short story. You'll hear more about why and what next week. And finally, we know now that South Suburban Parks and Rec is finalizing their recruitment materials for the executive director position, and there's still time, we think, for us to have a comment there. President of their board, thanks to, I will thank Councilmember Grove for getting some communication there on this. So we do have that opportunity. I just want to share a draft letter that I compiled that could be sent on our behalf, that just expresses, kind of summarizes the needs that I know I've heard from all of council over the last couple of years, and really emphasizes some of the things that I think we're looking for in their next director that will build the relationship we have with them for the future. So I would ask that council could take a look at this letter. We do want to get this to them in the next couple of days. So if you could have a look, send me an email or call me if you have any comments or additional things that you think we should mention. This is intended, to convey some pretty high level interest that we have and not really get into a lot of the project and maintenance specific things that we know will be part of the operating agreement discussions that we'll have over the next year, once they have their director in place. So with that, that's all I have, Mayor.
City Attorney?
No report, thank you, Mayor.
And just quick update for council, I don't know if you all got an email about ribbon cuttings and grand openings. Littleton Brewing Company is opening on the 15th of March, this weekend. Invited, at least I got an email to go to it, and during our retreat, I said, well, if we'll be at a retreat, we'll be back probably 5 or 6, maybe council members would be interested in having a beer after the retreat there, and he said, come on, anytime, so I'm aware that they're having their kind of grand opening then, and then the Fresh Market and Community Kitchen. I don't know why they said, the original email said they're not gonna change the ribbon cutting, cause I ran into him yesterday, he said he really wanted all of council there for the new grocery store that's in Woodlawn. And so they moved it to the 21st, so it'd be great. They switched it, yeah, so that was all, just you guys, I think you sent the email out, everyone saw that one, so.
If we're not having our tour until 1:30, are we gonna did we push the start time?
No, we think we just want to have a little more time to get from the lunch to the start of the tour.
That's on Friday?
Yes.
Alright, then we're done, adjourned.